Hi everyone, welcome to Pine Hat. I hope you're all doing well. Today, I want to argue that Stanley Pines, better known as Grunkle Stan from Gravity Falls, is one of the most psychologically complex characters in animated television. And while we cannot diagnose a cartoon character clinically, examining his behavior through a psychological lens reveals consistent patterns of trauma response, defensive deception, and profound capacity for self-sacrifice, hidden beneath layers of selfishness that trained psychologists would immediately recognize. By exploring how Stan relates to his family, how childhood rejection shaped his entire adult identity, how he uses lies as both survival mechanism and emotional armor, and how his criminal behavior masks a desperate need for redemption and belonging, we can understand what makes him such a fascinating study in defensive psychology and post-traumatic adaptation. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough. Let's begin. Understanding Stanley Pines requires starting at the beginning, looking at how one devastating moment of family rejection in Glass Shard Beach, New Jersey, fundamentally shaped every decision he would make for the next 40 years of his life. From the moment we learn Stan's backstory in A Tale of Two Stans, it becomes clear that his entire adult existence was built on the foundation of childhood trauma that occurred when he was only 17 years old. Stan was born 15 minutes after his twin brother Stanford in the late 1940s or early 1950s to Philbrick and Karen Pines. From their earliest days, the twins were inseparable. Stan provided the muscle, the street smarts, and the protective instincts, while Ford provided the genius-level intellect and scientific curiosity. Together, they were an unstoppable team who spent their childhood exploring the beaches near their home and dreaming of the day when they would sail away together on their boat, the Stan O'War, to become treasure hunters and adventurers. A psychologist observing the Pines family dynamic would immediately note several concerning elements in their childhood environment. Philbrick Pines ran a pawn shop called Pines Pawns and was portrayed as an emotionally distant, stern father who valued financial success and practical achievement above almost everything else. The show depicted him as someone who measured his son's worth primarily through the lens of potential earnings and financial contribution to the family. Their mother, Karine, worked at the shop as a phone psychic and told tall tales, but she appeared to defer to Philbrick's authority in most family decisions. This family dynamic created an environment where love felt conditional rather than unconditional. A psychologist would recognize this as a setup for significant attachment difficulties and self-worth issues in both twins. When parental approval depends primarily on achievement and financial success rather than on inherent worth as human beings, children often develop fragile self-esteem that requires constant external validation. The twins faced frequent bullying during their childhood. Stan was bullied for being physically weak and wimpy, while Ford was tormented for having 6 fingers on each hand due to polydactyly, a rare birth defect. Their primary tormentor was a boy named Krampelter, who made their lives miserable enough that Philbrick enrolled both boys in boxing lessons. A psychologist would note that this parental response focused on making the boys physically tougher rather than addressing the emotional impact of bullying or teaching healthier coping mechanisms. The message was clear. Toughen up, fight back, don't show vulnerability. Stan responded to this environment by eventually abandoning his glasses and changing his appearance to fit in with cooler crowds. He learned to use his fists and his street smarts to protect himself and his brother. A psychologist would recognize this as an adaptive response where Stan developed a tough, aggressive exterior to shield himself from vulnerability. This pattern of using toughness and bravado to hide softer emotions would become a lifelong defense mechanism. As the twins grew older, their paths began to diverge in ways that created tension beneath their close bond. Ford became an exceptional student whose scientific brilliance attracted attention from prestigious institutions. His perpetual motion machine project was drawing interest from West Coast Tech, one of the most prestigious universities in the country. Stan, meanwhile, struggled academically and had no clear path forward after high school. His girlfriend Carla Hotpants McCorkle left him for a hippie musician named Thistledown, adding to his sense of being left behind. A psychologist would observe that Stan was facing a developmental crisis common to late adolescence, the need to form an independent identity and find a meaningful life path. However, Stan's identity had always been defined in relation to Ford. He was Ford's twin, Ford's protector, the brawn to Ford's brains. The prospect of Ford leaving for college threatened to destroy the only identity Stan had ever known. The night before, the West Coast Tech representatives were scheduled to visit Ford's science fair project represents the pivotal trauma that would define Stan's entire adult life. Stan went to the high school gym where Ford's perpetual motion machine was on display. The episode shows Stan standing there, holding his bag of toffee peanuts, clearly wrestling with complicated emotions. He was losing his twin, his best friend, his partner in their shared dream of sailing the world together on the Stano War. In a moment of frustration and emotional turmoil, Stan leaned against the display table. The impact caused the perpetual motion machine to malfunction and stop working. When Ford and the West Coast Tech representatives arrived the next day, the machine was broken. Ford immediately found Stan's toffee peanuts bag at the scene and accused Stan of deliberately sabotaging his project. A psychologist analyzing this moment would note several psychologically significant elements. First, whether Stan's action was truly accidental or contained unconscious sabotage is ambiguous in the show. Stan clearly did not intend the specific outcome, but his physical proximity to the machine and his emotional state suggest complex motivations. Second, Ford's immediate accusation of deliberate sabotage without considering accident or asking for Stan's perspective represented a profound betrayal of their twin bond. Third, what happened next would constitute severe psychological trauma. Philbrick overheard the confrontation between the twins. Upon learning that Stan's presence had somehow resulted in the machine breaking and Ford losing his scholarship opportunity, Philbrick did not ask questions, did not investigate the full circumstances, and did not consider alternative explanations. Instead, he immediately disowned his 17-year-old son and threw him out of the house. The exact words Philbrick used were devastating. Stan was kicked out until you make us back the millions you cost us. A psychologist would recognize this as a catastrophic rupture in attachment and family belonging at a critical developmental stage. Stan was rejected by his father, implicitly blamed by his twin brother, and expelled from his home while still a minor with no resources, no support system, and no clear path forward. The message was unambiguous. Your worth is measured in financial terms. You have cost the family money, therefore you have no value and do not deserve to belong. The psychological impact of this rejection cannot be overstated. Research on parental rejection shows that it creates profound wounds to self-worth, generates intense shame, and often leads to lifelong patterns of trying to prove oneself worthy of love and belonging. For Stan, this single event became the defining trauma that would shape his next 40 years. The show depicts Ford watching Stan leave from their bedroom window. Ford looked sad, but closed the blinds and turned away to focus on his West Coast Tech pamphlet. For Stan, this represented not just loss of family, but loss of his twin, his closest relationship, his partner in their shared dreams. A psychologist would note that this constituted a double trauma: rejection by father and abandonment by twin brother. Stan left Glasshard Beach with nothing but the clothes on his back and his car, the Stanmobile. The show reveals through flashbacks that he initially tried to find treasure on beaches, then founded Stan Company. Enterprises selling various faulty products including sham total towels that made stains worse, rip-off bandages that gave people rashes, and poorly functioning Stan-Vac vacuum cleaners. Every venture failed. Stan was arrested multiple times, banned from 32 states, and lived such a transient, desperate existence that he was once forced to chew his way out of a car trunk. A psychologist examining Stan's behavior during these years would identify several trauma responses. First, his pattern of running cons and scams can be understood as an attempt to prove his worth through financial success, the only metric his father had valued. Second, his constant movement and inability to settle anywhere reflects both practical necessity, running from consequences, and psychological avoidance, running from emotional pain. Third, his development of multiple fake identities, including Stetson Pinefield, Hal Forrester, Andrew 8-Ball Alcatraz, and Steve Pinnington, suggests fragmentation of identity, a common response to severe rejection. The fake identities are particularly psychologically significant. When your authentic self has been rejected as worthless and undeserving of belonging, creating alternative identities serves multiple functions. It allows practical survival through crime while avoiding capture. It also represents a psychological splitting where the rejected Stanley Pines can be set aside while alternative versions of self navigate the world. A psychologist might observe that Stan never fully integrated a stable adult identity because his core identity was shattered at 17. Throughout these years, Stan accumulated an extensive criminal record. Tax evasion, fraud, breaking and entering, assault, theft, identity fraud, and countless other offenses. A psychologist would note that this criminal lifestyle served multiple psychological functions beyond simple survival. It represented rebellion against the authority that had rejected him. It demonstrated that if he could not be valued for legitimate achievement, he would survive through illegitimate means. It also kept him moving, never settling, never risking attachment that could lead to another rejection. The show reveals that Stan spent time in prison in Colombia, where he accumulated debt to dangerous individuals. He lived in his car at various points. He struggled with poverty despite his constant schemes. A psychologist would observe that Stan's criminal behavior was largely ineffective at achieving actual financial success, suggesting it served psychological needs more than practical ones. If financial success were truly the goal, Stan's intelligence and strategic thinking could have been applied to legitimate endeavors. The continued criminality suggests deeper motivations related to identity, self-worth, and unresolved trauma. Approximately 10 years after being kicked out, Stan received a postcard from Ford with just 2 words: "Please come." The postcard showed an address in Gravity Falls, Oregon. For Stan, this represented the possibility of reconciliation, of undoing the fundamental rejection, of reuniting with his twin, and perhaps reclaiming the relationship and the shared dreams that had been lost. Stan traveled to Gravity Falls with hope. The reunion, however, went catastrophically wrong. Ford had not called Stan to reconcile or apologize. Ford had called Stan because he needed help hiding Journal 1, part of his research documentation. Ford had been tricked by Bill Cipher into building an interdimensional portal that could destroy the universe. Ford realized the danger too late and wanted to prevent anyone from activating the portal by separating the journals that contained the portal's blueprints. When Stan arrived, Ford immediately handed him a journal and told him to take it as far away as possible and hide it. Stan was hurt and angry that Ford had called him only for practical help, not for reconciliation. A psychologist would recognize Stan's emotional reaction as entirely appropriate. He had traveled hoping to repair their relationship, only to discover Ford still viewed him instrumentally, as someone to be used rather than reconnected with as a brother. The confrontation escalated. Stan tried to express his hurt feelings and his desire to reconnect. Ford responded defensively, still harboring resentment about the science fair incident. The argument became physical. Stan accidentally pushed Ford backward. Ford stumbled through the still-active interdimensional portal. The portal immediately shut down, trapping Ford in another dimension with no apparent way to retrieve him. A psychologist analyzing this moment would identify it as a second catastrophic trauma layered on top of the original rejection. Stan had now not only been rejected by his twin, but had accidentally caused his twin to disappear into another dimension. The guilt, horror, and grief of this moment would be overwhelming. Stan had lost Ford once through rejection and abandonment. Now he had lost Ford again, this time through his own actions, however accidental. Stan's response to this trauma reveals important aspects of his psychology. He did not run away. He did not give up. Instead, he made a decision that would define the next 30 years of his life. He would bring Ford back, no matter how long it took or what it cost. This decision represents Stan's core psychological pattern. When faced with loss or rejection, respond with stubborn determination to fix it, to prove yourself worthy, to earn back what was lost. Stan assumed Ford's identity, took over his house, and began the decades-long project of reactivating the portal to bring Ford home. A psychologist would observe several significant elements in this decision. First, literally assuming Ford's identity represents a symbolic merging with the twin from whom he was separated. Second, dedicating his life to Ford's rescue represents an attempt at redemption for both the original science fair incident and the accidental portal push. Third, the sheer persistence required to maintain this project for 30 years reveals Stan's capacity for long-term commitment when emotionally motivated. The decision to impersonate Ford also required Stan to fake his own death. Stan arranged for Stanley Pines to die in a car crash, allowing him to assume Ford's identity completely. A psychologist might note the symbolic significance. The rejected Stanley, who cost his family millions and was deemed worthless, could die, while the valued Stanford could be inhabited and used as a shell for Stan's redemption project. These early experiences created the psychological foundation for everything Stan would become. A psychologist observing Stan's backstory would identify several key patterns. Severe attachment trauma from parental rejection and twin abandonment created profound wounds to self-worth and belonging. Extended period of survival through crime and transience prevented healthy identity formation. Unresolved guilt about both the science fair incident and the portal accident drove compensatory behavior. The decision to sacrifice his own identity and life to save Ford represented both redemption-seeking and continuation of the pattern where Stan defined himself through Ford rather than developing autonomous identity. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. These early traumas established Stan's psychological foundation, revealing how rejection and guilt would drive decades of deception as both survival strategy and penance. A psychologist observing Stanley Pines throughout Gravity Falls would immediately recognize that deception functions as his primary coping mechanism, serving simultaneously as defensive armor against vulnerability, practical survival tool, and elaborate penance for perceived sins. Stan's relationship with lying is fundamentally different from simple dishonesty or moral failing. It represents a complex psychological adaptation to multiple traumas and impossible circumstances. From the moment Stan assumed Ford's identity and took over the house in Gravity Falls, his entire existence became a lie. He was not Stanford Pines, brilliant researcher. He was Stanley Pines, failure and criminal, pretending to be his successful twin. Every interaction required maintaining this false identity. Every relationship was built on deception. A psychologist would note that living under a false identity for 30 years requires constant vigilance, creates profound isolation, and prevents authentic connection. Stan transformed Ford's research house into the Mystery Shack, a tourist trap filled with fake supernatural exhibits designed to separate the dumbest people in the world from their money. The attraction featured obviously false oddities like the Sasquatch, a Sasquatch made from cheap fur and store-bought parts. Stan's pitch to tourists was pure showmanship, delivered with a charismatic confidence that masked the cynical manipulation underneath. A psychologist analyzing the Mystery Shack would recognize it as psychologically revealing in several ways. First, the entire business model is based on deception, creating an environment where lying is normalized and necessary for survival. Second, Stan's contempt for the tourists he scams, dumbest people in the world, represents a defensive superiority that protects him from guilt about exploiting them. Third, the fake supernatural exhibits ironically exist in a town filled with genuine supernatural phenomena, suggesting Stan's relationship with truth is more complicated than simple dishonesty. The show reveals that Stan was highly aware of the genuine supernatural activity in Gravity Falls. He possessed Journal 1, which documented real paranormal phenomena. He knew Dipper's investigations into strange events were based on actual supernatural occurrences, not paranoid imagination. Yet, Stan consistently played dumb, dismissing the supernatural as nonsense and calling Dipper paranoid for investigating it. A psychologist would recognize this particular form of lying as serving multiple purposes. Practically, it protected the twins from discovering the portal in the basement, which would expose Stan's true identity and his dangerous project. Psychologically, it allowed Stan to maintain emotional distance by dismissing the children's concerns rather than engaging authentically with them. Strategically, it positioned Stan as the practical, no-nonsense adult who kept the children grounded in reality, earning their trust while maintaining his cover. Stan's verbal communication style throughout the series featured constant low-level dishonesty. He lied about prices at the Mystery Shack. He lied about the origins of exhibits. He lied about his past. He lied about his feelings. A psychologist might note that lying had become so habitual for Stan that truth-telling would actually feel more unnatural and uncomfortable than deception. Bottomless Pit from Season 1 explored Stan's lying through Mabel's story, where she used truth-telling teeth to force Stan to be honest. When compelled to speak only truth, Stan immediately got himself and the children into trouble. He insulted people who needed to be placated. He revealed things that needed to remain secret. He nearly got arrested. The episode suggested that Stan's lies, while morally problematic, actually served important protective functions in his specific circumstances. A psychologist analyzing this episode would observe that Stan had developed such elaborate deceptive strategies because his actual circumstances were genuinely dangerous and complicated. He was operating an illegal portal in his basement, living under a stolen identity, running a fraudulent business, and evading law enforcement from multiple jurisdictions. In this context, truth-telling was actually more dangerous than lying. His deception had become a necessary survival adaptation rather than simple moral failing. Stan's capacity for maintaining long-term deceptions was extraordinary. For 30 years, he convinced an entire town that he was Stanford Pines. He built relationships, ran a business, and became a community fixture, all while maintaining a false identity. A psychologist would note that this requires remarkable cognitive abilities, including excellent memory for false narratives, quick thinking to adapt lies when challenged, and emotional control to prevent genuine feelings from exposing the deception. The show depicts Stan as highly skilled at reading people and adapting his approach to manipulate them effectively. With tourists, he used showmanship and flattery. With government agents, he used misdirection and bureaucratic confusion. With the children, he used selective truth-telling mixed with protective lies. A psychologist would recognize these as sophisticated social manipulation skills that Stan had developed through decades of survival on society's margins. However, Stan's deception carried significant psychological costs. Living under constant deception prevents authentic self-expression and genuine connection. When you cannot reveal your true identity, history, or motivations, you cannot be truly known by others. This creates profound loneliness even when surrounded by people. A psychologist would observe that Stan's gruff, emotionally distant demeanor served partly to manage this loneliness by preventing too much intimacy that might expose his deceptions. Dreamscaperers from Season 1 provided unique psychological insight into Stan's mind through the mindscape sequences. When Bill Cipher entered Stan's mind searching for the safe combination, Dipper, Mabel, and Seuss had to navigate Stan's mental landscape to stop him. The mindscape was depicted as a deteriorating black and white version of the Mystery Shack, falling apart and filled with locked doors, hidden passages, and compartmentalized memories. A psychologist analyzing Stan's mindscape would note several revealing features. The black and white coloring suggested depression or emotional numbness. The deteriorating structure suggested psychological distress and fragmentation. The labyrinthine layout with many locked doors suggested compartmentalization, a defense mechanism where different memories and emotions are kept separated to prevent overwhelming distress. The presence of a fears box and hopes and dreams doors suggested that Stan kept his deepest vulnerabilities carefully hidden and protected. The episode revealed that Stan was fully aware of the invasion of his mind and deliberately helped the children navigate it, showing that even his own mindscape contained deceptive elements and strategic misdirection. A psychologist would note that Stan's defenses operated even at unconscious levels, suggesting deeply ingrained patterns of self-protection through deception. When the children discovered the safe combination in Stan's memories, they saw Stan's motivations were more complex than simple greed. They glimpsed that Stan cared about them more than he admitted. However, the episode also showed Stan's immediate defensive response when questioned: deflection, dismissal, and quick subject change. A psychologist would recognize this as Stan's automatic response to vulnerability. Shut it down quickly before genuine emotions can be exposed or explored. Stan's relationship with money provides another window into his psychological patterns around deception and survival. He was portrayed as extremely cheap and obsessed with maximizing profit from the Mystery Shack. He paid Seuss and Wendy minimal wages. He used the children as free labor. He engaged in constant tax evasion and financial fraud. Surface-level analysis might label this as simple greed. However, a psychologist examining Stan's relationship with money more deeply would recognize it as driven by trauma-based insecurity rather than primary greed. Stan had been disowned for costing the family millions. He had spent decades in poverty, sometimes living in his car. Money represented security, survival, and perhaps unconscious attempt to prove he was not the financial burden his father had labeled him. Stan's money obsession was less about wealth accumulation and more about never being that powerless, poor, rejected person again. The show revealed that Stan actually spent enormous amounts of money on the secret portal project. Running that portal consumed massive electricity. Building and maintaining it required expensive materials and equipment. A psychologist would observe that Stan was willing to spend whatever necessary for his redemption project of saving Ford, while simultaneously being extremely cheap in daily operations. This suggests his financial behavior was driven by specific psychological needs rather than consistent philosophy about money. Stan's lies to Dipper and Mabel throughout the first season created increasingly complicated situations. He told them their parents sent them to Gravity Falls for fresh air, omitting that he had specifically requested they come to help with the Mystery Shack. He claimed the supernatural didn't exist while knowing it did. He presented himself as their carefree, somewhat irresponsible Grunkle while secretly working on a project that could destroy the universe. A psychologist would note the ethical complexity here. Stan's lies protected the children from dangerous knowledge about the portal. His deceptions kept them safely unaware of the risks he was taking. Yet, these same lies prevented authentic relationship and placed the children in danger they didn't know they faced. Stan's protective deception contained both genuine care and significant harm. Not what he seems from Season 2 brought Stan's deceptions to a crisis point. Government agents arrived to arrest Stan for identity theft, possession of dangerous machinery, and various other crimes. Dipper discovered that Stan was not who he claimed to be. The episode built to a moment where Dipper had to choose whether to trust Stan despite all the lies or to shut down the portal Stan had spent 30 years building. The confrontation in the basement was psychologically revealing. When Dipper confronted Stan about his lies, Stan's response was not explanation or apology. He said, "Dipper, just trust me." A psychologist would note this as characteristic of Stan's defensive patterns. When exposed, don't explain or show vulnerability. Just demand trust without earning it through honesty. Stan had so thoroughly adopted deception as his mode that even in crisis, transparency felt impossible. The episode showed Mabel choosing to trust Stan despite not understanding his motivations. She pressed the button to keep the portal running, allowing it to complete its 30-year purpose. Ford emerged from the portal, and Stan's enormous secret was revealed. Everything he had done for 30 years was to save his brother. His deception had a noble purpose, even though the methods were questionable and dangerous. A psychologist analyzing this reveal would note that it reframed Stan's lies from pure self-serving manipulation to complex mixture of redemption-seeking, penance, and protection. Stan had indeed lived a lie, stolen an identity, and endangered the universe. He had also sacrificed his own life, identity, and happiness for 30 years to save his brother. The deception contained both genuine harm and profound self-sacrifice. However, Ford's reaction to being rescued revealed that Stan's redemption project would not immediately heal their relationship or Stan's psychological wounds. Ford was not grateful. He was angry that Stan had activated the portal despite warnings about its danger. He accused Stan of risking the universe for selfish reasons. Their reunion quickly devolved into the same old sibling conflict, suggesting that 30 years of penance had not actually resolved the underlying psychological dynamics. A psychologist would observe that Stan's entire redemption project was based on a psychological error. He believed that saving Ford would somehow erase the original rejection, prove his worth, and restore their relationship. But redemption doesn't work that way. External actions cannot heal internal wounds of self-worth. Saving Ford was important, but it could not retroactively make the rejection unhappen or fundamentally change Stan's damaged sense of self. Stan's defensive patterns around deception continued even after his primary secret was exposed. He was not suddenly honest and transparent. Years of habitual lying had created ingrained patterns that persisted. In later episodes, Stan continued to manipulate, exaggerate, and deceive in smaller ways, showing that deception had become part of his fundamental relationship style, not just a temporary necessary evil. The psychological function of Stan's deception throughout the series operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Practically, it allowed survival and protected dangerous secrets. Defensively, it prevented vulnerability and authentic connection that might lead to rejection. Compulsively, it had become so habitual that truth-telling felt foreign and uncomfortable. Redemptively, it served his larger project of saving Ford and proving his worth. A psychologist would note that understanding Stan's lying requires recognizing all these functions operating simultaneously rather than reducing it to simple dishonesty. Stan's lies also revealed important information about his self-concept. He lied to present himself as tougher, more competent, and more successful than he actually was. These lies suggested underlying feelings of inadequacy and worthlessness that needed to be hidden. A psychologist would recognize defensive grandiosity. When you feel fundamentally worthless, you compensate by exaggerating your capabilities and achievements. The relationship between Stan's criminal history and his psychological patterns is also significant. Stan was banned from 32 states. He had been arrested multiple times. He engaged in tax evasion, fraud, and countless other crimes. A psychologist would note that Stan's criminality served multiple psychological functions beyond material gain. It represented identity as an outlaw and reject, making permanent the role his father had assigned. It protected against future rejection by ensuring he would be rejected, making the rejection feel controlled rather than surprising. It also represented rebellion against the authority that had failed to protect him. Throughout the series, Stan's deception created a fundamental tension. He wanted connection and belonging, but his defensive patterns prevented the vulnerability required for genuine connection. He cared deeply about Dipper and Mabel, but he couldn't express that care directly or honestly. He wanted reconciliation with Ford, but he couldn't approach it without defensiveness and conflict. A psychologist would recognize this as a classic trauma pattern. The very defenses that helped you survive prevent you from achieving what you most need. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Stan's elaborate deceptions served as protective armor against vulnerability. Yet, this same armor prevented the genuine connection he desperately craved, creating patterns that appeared selfish while hiding profound self-sacrifice. A psychologist observing Stanley Pines's relationships with Dipper and Mabel throughout Gravity Falls would identify a fascinating contradiction at the core of his emotional life. Stan presented himself as a gruff, selfish, emotionally unavailable guardian who viewed the twins primarily as free labor for the Mystery Shack. Yet beneath this defensive exterior, Stan demonstrated profound love and fierce protectiveness that he struggled to express directly due to decades of emotional guardedness and fear of vulnerability. When Dipper and Mabel first arrived in Gravity Falls at the beginning of summer 2012, Stan's initial presentation matched his public persona perfectly. He put them to work immediately, assigned them tedious tasks, complained about the minimum wage he was required to pay Seuss and Wendy, and treated the children's presence as primarily a business opportunity. He made them hang signs, clean the toilets, and handle various Mystery Shack operations with minimal compensation. A psychologist would note that Stan's initial treatment of the twins reflected his learned patterns of emotional distance and transactional relationships. After decades of viewing people primarily as marks to con or threats to avoid, genuine familial warmth did not come naturally. Stan had spent 30 years in isolation, maintaining a false identity and working obsessively on his Portal project. He had not practiced being in authentic relationship or expressing genuine affection. However, subtle signs of Stan's deeper feelings for the twins appeared almost immediately, visible to anyone paying attention beneath his gruff exterior. In Tourist Trapped, the series premiere, when Dipper was in genuine danger from the gnomes, Stan immediately became protective and helped defeat them. He downplayed his concern afterward with dismissive comments, but his actions revealed care beneath the crusty surface. The legend of the Gobblewonker from Season 1 provided crucial insight into Stan's emotional needs and his relationship with the twins. Stan planned a fishing trip specifically to bond with Dipper and Mabel, even making them personalized fishing hats. When the twins ditched him to hunt for the Gobblewonker with Seuss, Stan's reaction revealed how much their rejection hurt him. though he tried to hide it through gruff dismissal. A psychologist analyzing this episode would note several psychologically significant elements. First, Stan's attempt to bond through fishing showed he wanted connection with the twins, but lacked skills for creating it. Second, his creation of personalized hats revealed he had put thought and effort into making them feel special, contradicting his self-presentation as uncaring. Third, his hurt response to their rejection showed he was emotionally vulnerable to their acceptance or rejection of him, despite pretending not to care. The episode showed Stan spending the day trying to find alternative fishing companions, being rejected by everyone he approached. This sequence was played for comedy, but contained genuine pathos. Stan was alone in a town where he had lived for years, unable to find a single person willing to spend time with him. A psychologist would recognize this as revealing the profound isolation Stan experienced despite being a community fixture. His deceptions and gruff demeanor had prevented genuine friendships. When Dipper and Mabel returned feeling guilty for ditching Stan, they found him seemingly unbothered, pretending he'd had a great day. His immediate forgiveness and willingness to bond with them then showed his desperate need for family connection. A psychologist would note that Stan quickly forgave because he couldn't risk losing their affection through holding grudges. His fear of abandonment made him accept whatever relationship they offered. Throughout Season 1, a pattern emerged where Stan would initially present as selfish or uncaring, but his actions consistently revealed deeper care. In Dipper versus Manliness, Stan gave Dipper advice about masculinity that, while crude, came from genuine concern about Dipper's insecurity. In Boss Mabel, Stan let Mabel run the mystery shack for a week despite knowing she would struggle, allowing her to learn through experience rather than simply telling her no. A psychologist would observe that Stan's parenting style, while unconventional and problematic in some ways, actually contained elements of respect for the children's autonomy. He let them make mistakes and learn from consequences rather than hovering protectively. This approach likely stemmed partly from Stan's own lack of parenting models and partly from his survival-based worldview where learning to handle challenges independently was essential. Stan's protectiveness became most visible when the twins faced genuine danger. In Dreamscaperers, when Bill Cipher invaded Stan's mind, Stan actively helped Dipper, Mabel, and Seuss navigate his mindscape to stop Bill, even though this exposed personal vulnerabilities. In Gideon Rice's, when Gideon took over the Mystery Shack and Stan lost his home and business, his primary concern was having failed to protect the twins and provide for them. A psychologist analyzing Gideon Rises would note how Stan's self-worth was tied to his ability to provide materially for the twins. When he lost the Mystery Shack, he didn't just lose his home and business, he lost his sense of purpose and his ability to fulfill what he saw as his primary function in the children's lives. Stan told Dipper and Mabel's parents the twins were staying at a 4-star hotel, while actually living with Seuss's grandmother in cramped conditions, showing his shame about failing to provide. The episode also showed Stan's willingness to take physical risks for the twins. When Dipper and Mabel fell from a great height, Stan immediately ran to save them despite the danger to himself. His heroic rescue won him the mayoral election temporarily, though his extensive criminal record resulted in the title being stripped. A psychologist would note that Stan demonstrated clear behavioral evidence of love through protective action, even though verbal expressions of affection remained difficult. Stan's discomfort with emotional vulnerability and verbal expressions of affection appeared throughout the series. He rarely said, "I love you," or directly expressed his feelings. When the twins tried to have emotional conversations, Stan typically deflected with jokes, changed the subject, or turned it into a lesson about toughness. A psychologist would recognize this as consistent with his defensive patterns developed through decades of emotional self-protection. However, Stan found indirect ways to show his care. He kept a photo of Dipper and Mabel on his desk despite claiming to be annoyed by their presence. He went to extraordinary lengths to give them good summer experiences. He created elaborate schemes to ensure they could attend events they wanted to attend. A psychologist would observe that Stan's love language was primarily action-based rather than verbally expressive, showing care through what he did rather than what he said. Scary OK from Season 2 showed Stan's reaction when government agents arrived investigating anomalies. His immediate concern was protecting the twins from discovering the portal and from getting involved in dangerous government business. He tried to keep them safely unaware, even though this required more lies. A psychologist would note the ethical complexity. Stan's protective deception kept them safer in some ways while placing them in unknown danger from the portal. The relationship between Stan and Dipper had particular psychological complexity. Dipper reminded Stan of Ford in many ways: curious, intelligent, investigative, somewhat socially awkward. Stan's treatment of Dipper mixed gruff affection with occasional harshness that seemed designed to toughen him up. Stan made fun of Dipper's voice cracks, his crush on Wendy, and his physical weakness, presenting this mockery as helpful preparation for a harsh world. A psychologist would recognize that Stan was likely repeating patterns from his own childhood, where Philbrick's toughening up approach involved boxing lessons and emotional distance. Stan believed he was helping Dipper by teaching him not to show vulnerability, not to trust too easily, and to be able to defend himself. However, this approach also risked damaging Dipper's self-esteem and making him feel inadequate, similar to how Stan himself had felt. Interestingly, Stan seemed somewhat more gentle with Mabel, possibly because she didn't trigger the same Ford-related associations. Mabel's cheerful optimism and emotional openness were foreign to Stan's worldview, but seemed to touch something in him. He supported her various schemes and crushes, protected her from heartbreak when possible, and showed patience with her chaos. A psychologist might note that Mabel's unconditional affection for Stan, despite his flaws, provided him something he desperately needed: acceptance without having to prove worth. Not what he seems represented a crisis point in Stan's relationship with the twins. When his deception was exposed and government agents were arresting him, Stan had to rely on Dipper and Mabel's trust, despite having lied to them all summer. The moment where Mabel chose to press the button, trusting Stan despite not understanding why, was psychologically profound. It showed that Mabel had perceived Stan's genuine care beneath his lies and was willing to trust that care even when confused and frightened. A psychologist would observe that Mabel's choice represented precisely the kind of unconditional acceptance Stan had been denied by his father and Ford. She didn't require him to explain, justify, or prove himself. She simply trusted that beneath all the deception, Stan loved them and wouldn't truly endanger them. This acceptance likely had profound emotional impact on Stan, even if he couldn't articulate it. Dipper's choice was more conflicted. He wavered between trusting Stan and protecting Mabel by shutting down the portal. His uncertainty revealed that Stan's emotional distance and constant lying had created genuine ambivalence. A psychologist would note that Stan's defensive patterns had consequences. They prevented the kind of secure attachment that would make trust automatic even in crisis. After Ford's return, Stan's relationship with the twins continued to deepen despite the complicated family dynamics. Stan remained their primary caregiver during the second half of summer, while Ford focused on his research and recovery. Stan continued running the Mystery Shack, hosting the twins, and trying to give them positive summer experiences despite his deteriorating relationship with Ford. A tale of two Stans forced Stan to reveal his true history to the twins. The storytelling session where Stan explained everything: the science fair incident, being disowned, the decades of crime and failure, accidentally pushing Ford through the portal, the 30-year project to bring him back, represented the most emotional vulnerability Stan had shown them. A psychologist would note how difficult this disclosure was for Stan, forcing him to reveal all the shame, failure, and pain he normally kept hidden. The twins' response to learning Stan's history showed how much their relationship had deepened. They didn't reject him for his lies or his criminal past. Instead, they understood him more completely and appreciated the sacrifice he'd made. A psychologist would observe that this acceptance of Stan's full truth, including shameful parts, provided corrective emotional experience for someone who believed his authentic self was unworthy of love. However, Stan's continued conflict with Ford created stress for the twins. They witnessed the brothers fighting, saying hurtful things, and unable to reconcile despite both loving each other. Dipper and Mabel found themselves caught between their grunkles, trying to facilitate reconciliation while dealing with their own attachments to both. A psychologist would note that the twins were placed in a parentified role, trying to manage adult emotional dynamics beyond their developmental capacity. Stan's relationship with Zeus provided another window into his capacity for care beneath his gruff exterior. Stan employed Zeus as his handyman, paying him minimal wage and frequently exploiting his labor. Yet Stan also clearly cared about Zeus, valued his loyalty, and eventually made him manager of the Mystery Shack. In Blendin's game, Stan's gift to Zeus of a birthday party showed genuine thoughtfulness beneath his usual emotional unavailability. A psychologist would observe that Stan's relationship with Zeus followed similar patterns to his relationship with the twins. Surface-level exploitation and emotional distance masking genuine affection and loyalty. Stan trusted Zeus enough to involve him in various schemes, valued his presence, and showed concern when Zeus was hurt. However, Stan struggled to express this care directly, maintaining emotional distance through employer-employee dynamics. Stan's relationship with Wendy was more distant, but still showed his protective instincts. He gave her tremendous autonomy as an employee, often letting her sleep on the job or ignore responsibilities. This could be interpreted as neglectful management, but a psychologist might also see it as Stan respecting Wendy's competence and giving her the independence he wished he'd had at her age. The psychological pattern across all Stan's relationships was consistent. He cared deeply, but expressed that care primarily through action and protection rather than emotional vulnerability and verbal affection. He deflected sincere emotional moments with jokes or gruffness. He downplayed his own sacrifices and contributions. He maintained defensive distance while simultaneously showing fierce loyalty. A psychologist would recognize these patterns as typical of someone with deep attachment wounds who desperately wants connection but fears the vulnerability it requires. Stan's greatest fear appeared to be that if people saw his true self, the failure, the criminal, the rejected son, the man who cost his family millions and accidentally banished his brother, they would reject him as his father and Ford had done. His defensive patterns were designed to prevent this by never letting people close enough to fully know him. The tragedy was that these same patterns prevented him from receiving the unconditional acceptance he desperately needed. The twins' love for Stan, despite knowing his full truth, provided something psychologically healing. They knew about his lies, his crimes, his failures, and his mistakes. They knew he'd endangered the universe to save Ford. They knew he'd been selfish, cheap, and manipulative, and they loved him anyway. A psychologist would recognize this as providing Stan with the corrective experience of being fully known and still accepted. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Stan's relationships revealed his capacity for profound love hidden beneath defensive gruffness. Yet his deepest relationship with his twin brother Ford contained the most complicated psychological dynamics of all. A psychologist examining the relationship between Stanley and Stanford Pines would identify one of the most psychologically complex sibling dynamics in animated television. Their relationship contained elements of profound love and attachment, devastating betrayal and abandonment, codependent identity fusion, competitive resentment, and unresolved trauma spanning 40 years. Understanding this relationship is essential to understanding Stan's psychology because his entire adult identity was constructed around the wound of losing Ford and the project of recovering him. From birth, the twins were positioned in complementary but unequal roles. Ford was the genius, the achiever, the son who would make the family proud and wealthy. Stan was the protector, the muscle, the supporting character in Ford's narrative. A psychologist would recognize this as a problematic family dynamic where one child is identified as the golden child destined for success, while the other becomes the scapegoat or lost child defined primarily in relation to the golden child's achievements. This dynamic was reinforced throughout their childhood. Ford received attention and praise for his intelligence despite being bullied for his 6 fingers. Stan received less recognition but was valued for protecting Ford and providing the brawn to Ford's brains. Their complementary strengths created an effective partnership, but it also meant Stan's identity was derivative rather than independent. He was Ford's twin, Ford's protector, never fully Stan as his own person. The twins' shared dream of sailing the world on the Stan-O War represented their most positive bond. They spent years building the boat together, planning adventures, imagining a future where they would be treasure hunters and explorers. A psychologist would note that this shared dream allowed both twins to have equal stake in a future together, unlike the academic path where Ford would leave Stan behind. The boat represented a future where their complementary roles would remain relevant and valued. When West Coast Tech recruited Ford, it shattered the shared dream and exposed the inequality in their relationship. Ford could pursue individual achievement and success without Stan. Stan could not imagine a future without Ford. A psychologist would recognize this as revealing underlying codependency, where Stan's sense of self was fused with Ford's identity rather than being independently developed. The night of the science fair incident revealed the deep psychological complexity in their relationship. Whether Stan's action was purely accidental or contained unconscious sabotage remains somewhat ambiguous in the show. Psychologically, it's entirely possible that Stan's conscious intention was not to break the machine, but unconscious motivations around fear of abandonment influenced his behavior in that moment. A psychologist would note that unconscious processes can drive behavior without conscious awareness or intention. Ford's immediate accusation of deliberate sabotage represented a profound failure of empathy and trust. Ford jumped to the worst interpretation without considering accident, without asking for Stan's perspective, and without acknowledging the emotional difficulty Stan faced losing his twin and their shared dream. A psychologist would observe that Ford's reaction revealed he had always seen Stan as less intelligent, less disciplined, potentially destructive, essentially confirming the family's valuation hierarchy where Ford was worthy and Stan was problematic. Philbrick's decision to disown Stan based on Ford's accusation showed how completely the family had internalized Ford as valuable and Stan as expendable. Philbrick didn't investigate, didn't ask Stan's side, didn't consider that both twins might be hurting and need support. He simply expelled the twin who had cost them money. A psychologist would note that this family response confirmed for Stan that his worth was entirely conditional on usefulness to Ford's success. Ford's passive complicity in Stan's expulsion, watching from the window, closing the blinds, turning to his West Coast Tech pamphlet, represented abandonment that may have hurt Stan even more than his father's rejection. Ford chose his academic future over his twin. He let Stan leave without fighting for him, without questioning their father's decision, without maintaining contact. A psychologist would recognize this as Stan experiencing abandonment from the person he loved most and had structured his entire identity around. The 10 years between Stan's expulsion and Ford's postcard were psychologically crucial. Stan spent this decade as a homeless criminal, accumulating trauma and developing defensive patterns. Ford spent this decade becoming an accomplished researcher, earning his PhD and pursuing his work in Gravity Falls. Their lives diverged completely. A psychologist would note that this decade deepened the inequality and resentment that had always existed beneath their surface bond. When Ford finally contacted Stan, it was not to apologize or reconcile. It was to use Stan instrumentally to hide a journal and prevent the portal's activation. Stan's hurt reaction was entirely appropriate. He had hoped for reconciliation and received only instrumental exploitation. A psychologist would observe that this interaction recapitulated the original dynamic. Ford as important person pursuing significant goals, Stan as useful tool to be deployed for Ford's purposes. The argument that led to Ford going through the portal contained decades of compressed resentment and pain. Stan tried to express his hurt at Ford's instrumental treatment. Ford responded defensively, still holding resentment about the science fair. Neither brother could hear the other's perspective or validate the other's pain. A psychologist would recognize this as characteristic of unresolved trauma, where each person is so caught in their own hurt that they cannot access empathy for the other's experience. Stan's decision to spend 30 years rescuing Ford represented the most profound act of self-sacrifice in the series, but it also revealed ongoing psychological patterns. Stan literally sacrificed his identity, faking his death and assuming Ford's life to save his twin. A psychologist would observe multiple psychological motivations operating simultaneously. Stan genuinely loved Ford and felt devastated by losing him. Stan felt guilty about the portal accident and needed to make amends. Stan believed rescuing Ford would finally prove his worth and earn Ford's love and acceptance. Stan's identity was so fused with Ford that losing Ford meant losing himself, making rescue psychologically necessary. The 30-year project served as penance for both the science fair incident and the portal accident, but it also represented continuing codependency. Stan could not develop independent identity or pursue his own life because his psychological energy was entirely consumed by the Ford project. A psychologist would note that while Stan's sacrifice was heroic in many ways, it also prevented him from processing trauma, developing autonomous identity, or building healthy relationships. Living as Ford for 30 years created additional psychological complexity. Stan inhabited his twin's identity, lived in his house, wore his clothes, and responded to his name. A psychologist might observe this as both practical necessity and symbolic fusion with the twin from whom he'd been separated. Stan was literally trying to be Ford, while simultaneously trying to rescue Ford, creating a complex psychological state where boundaries between self and twin became profoundly blurred. When Ford finally emerged from the portal, Stan expected gratitude, appreciation, and reconciliation. Instead, Ford was immediately angry that Stan had activated the portal despite its dangers. Ford accused Stan of risking universal destruction for selfish reasons without acknowledging the 30-year sacrifice Stan had made. A psychologist would recognize this as profoundly re-traumatizing for Stan. Once again, his enormous efforts were dismissed, his sacrifices unrecognized, his worth denied. The post-reunion conflict between the twins revealed how little had actually been resolved despite 30 years apart. Ford still saw Stan as irresponsible and reckless. Stan still resented Ford's intellectual superiority and dismissiveness. Ford focused on the risks Stan had taken. Stan focused on the sacrifice he'd made. Neither could fully acknowledge the other's perspective. A psychologist would observe that decades of separation had not healed the original wounds. It had simply frozen them in time. A tale of two Stans forced both twins to reveal their full history to Dipper and Mabel, creating the first opportunity for complete honesty between them. The storytelling was psychologically significant because both twins had to present their perspectives while the other listened. Ford heard how completely Stan had sacrificed for him. Stan heard how Bill Cipher had manipulated and betrayed Ford. Both began to understand the other's motivations more fully. However, understanding didn't immediately resolve their conflict. The government agent's interruption prevented emotional processing, and the practical crisis took priority. A psychologist would note that trauma resolution requires not just intellectual understanding, but emotional processing, vulnerability, and mutual validation, none of which the twins had space for amid the ongoing crises. The second half of Season 2 showed the twins attempting to coexist in the Mystery Shack while preparing for Bill Cipher's threat. Their interactions mixed genuine cooperation with continued resentment. Ford focused on research while Stan continued running the shack and caring for Dipper and Mabel. Ford criticized Stan's lifestyle and choices. Stan resented Ford's intellectual superiority and lack of appreciation. A psychologist would observe both twins falling into old patterns despite their best intentions. Dungeons, and more dungeons showed the twins competing for Dipper's attention and respect, revealing their underlying insecurity and jealousy. Ford bonded with Dipper over intellectual pursuits, making Stan feel inadequate and excluded. Stan attempted to connect with Dipper through activities he valued, feeling hurt when Dipper preferred Ford's company. A psychologist would recognize this as recapitulating childhood dynamics where Stan felt inferior to Ford and feared being replaced or forgotten. The episode resolved with both twins learning to appreciate the other's strengths and share relationship with Dipper rather than competing. However, this resolution was somewhat superficial, not addressing the deeper resentments and wounds. A psychologist would note that one positive interaction doesn't undo decades of painful dynamics. The Stanturian candidate showed the twins working together to help Stan run for mayor, but even this cooperation contained underlying tension. Ford used a tie with mind control properties to make Stan the perfect candidate, literally controlling Stan's behavior and speech. When Stan discovered the manipulation, he was hurt and angry. A psychologist would observe that Ford still tried to control and fix Stan rather than accepting him as he was. Throughout their interactions, certain patterns appeared repeatedly. Ford intellectualized and avoided emotional expression. Stan deflected with humor and gruffness. Ford criticized Stan's lack of education and sophistication. Stan resented Ford's condescension and superiority. Neither could express vulnerability directly. Neither could say, "I'm sorry, I was wrong," or "I love you," without defensive qualifications. A psychologist would recognize these as deeply ingrained defensive patterns developed to protect against emotional pain. The twins' inability to execute the Zodiac ritual in Weirdmageddon Part 3 directly resulted from their unresolved conflict. The ritual required 10 people representing different symbols to hold hands in a circle. When Stan and Ford needed to join hands as part of the circle, they couldn't help but argue. Ford corrected Stan's grammar. Stan reacted defensively. Their argument broke the circle at the crucial moment, allowing Bill to escape and turn everyone to tapestries. A psychologist analyzing this scene would note its psychological accuracy. In moments of high stress, people revert to their most ingrained patterns. The twins' unresolved resentment and inability to work together without conflict emerged precisely when they needed cooperation most. Decades of pain couldn't be overcome simply because circumstances required it. Real psychological healing doesn't work that way. Imprisoned together by Bill, the twins finally had a moment of honest vulnerability. Stan expressed his deepest fear that his father had been right about him being a screw-up who destroyed everything he touched. Ford responded with vulnerability of his own, acknowledging that he was the one who had made the deal with Bill and fallen for his manipulation. He said Stan would have seen Bill for the scam artist he is immediately, offering genuine respect for Stan's street smarts and social intelligence. A psychologist would recognize this exchange as containing crucial elements of healing. Stan expressing his core wound of feeling fundamentally flawed and worthless, Ford validating Stan's worth and acknowledging his own mistakes. This represented more emotional honesty than the twins had managed in 40 years. The crisis created space for vulnerability that normal circumstances didn't allow. The twins' plan to defeat Bill required profound trust and cooperation. They would switch clothes so Bill would enter Stan's mind thinking it was Ford's. Then Ford would use the memory gun to erase Stan's mind and destroy Bill. This plan required Stan to voluntarily sacrifice his memories and identity to save everyone. It required Ford to trust Stan to execute the plan and to perform the devastating act of erasing his twin's mind. A psychologist would observe the psychological significance of this plan. Stan once again sacrificed everything for Ford and the family. Ford finally had to fully trust Stan's competence and intelligence, recognizing that only Stan could execute the deception. The plan worked precisely because Stan understood deception better than anyone. His lifetime of cons finally served heroic purpose. Ford had to acknowledge Stan's unique value rather than just his intellectual inferiority. Stan's willingness to sacrifice his memories revealed the depth of his love for Ford, Dipper, Mabel, and everyone in Gravity Falls. After spending 30 years building memories and relationships, after finally being known and accepted, Stan chose to lose it all to save them. A psychologist would note this as the ultimate expression of love, choosing others' survival over self-preservation or identity maintenance. Ford's anguish at erasing Stan's mind showed his love for Stan beneath their conflicts. Despite everything, despite decades of resentment and hurt, Ford loved his twin and was devastated by having to destroy his memories. His words as he prepared to fire the memory gun, "I wish I could tell you that you saved the world," revealed his recognition of Stan's heroism and his grief that Stan would never know his own importance. The memory erasure and recovery formed the emotional climax of the series and the twin relationship. Stan woke with no memories, not recognizing anyone or knowing who he was. The family worked desperately to restore his memories through Mabel's scrapbook and shared experiences. The process was gradual, showing that identity and memory are complex and not easily reconstructed. A psychologist would observe that the memory recovery sequence showed the twins' relationship transformed. Ford openly acknowledged Stan as their hero who saved the universe. Ford openly showed affection and vulnerability that he'd never managed before. The near loss of Stan completely shifted Ford's perspective, allowing him to finally express the love and appreciation he'd always felt but couldn't show. Stan's memories eventually returned through the power of family bonds and shared experiences. The show suggested that the deepest memories and emotions were preserved somewhere in Stan's mind, accessible through love and persistence. A psychologist might note this as somewhat simplified. Real memory damage doesn't work quite this way, but psychologically resonant as metaphor. The relationships and love that defined Stan persisted even when explicit memories were gone. After the memory recovery, the twins' relationship was fundamentally changed. They recognized how close they'd come to losing each other permanently. They acknowledged their mutual love and the ways they'd hurt each other. They chose to pursue their childhood dream of sailing the world together on the Stan O'War II, finally prioritizing their relationship and shared dreams over everything else. A psychologist would observe this resolution as psychologically satisfying but somewhat idealized. Real trauma recovery and relationship healing are messier and more gradual than depicted. However, the fundamental arc, From unresolved resentment through crisis-forced vulnerability to conscious choice of relationship over pride, represents a psychologically coherent healing journey. The twins' decision to sail the world together represented both fulfillment of childhood dream and conscious choice of relationship. Unlike their childhood, where they were simply together by default, this was active choice to prioritize their bond. Unlike Stan's 30-year project to rescue Ford, this was mutual choice where both twins valued the relationship equally. A psychologist would recognize this as representing healthy interdependence rather than codependence, choosing to be together while maintaining separate identities. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The twin dynamic revealed how childhood wounds and unresolved trauma can persist for decades, yet also showed that crisis and vulnerability can create space for healing and transformation that normal circumstances don't allow. A psychologist examining Stanley Pines' decades-long career as a con artist and criminal would recognize this identity not simply as moral failing, but as complex psychological adaptation to trauma, rejection, and impossible circumstances. Stan's criminal behavior served multiple simultaneous functions: practical survival strategy, rebellion against rejecting authority, performance of the identity his father assigned him, and perhaps most significantly, protection against the vulnerability of trying and failing at legitimate success. When 17-year-old Stan was expelled from his family with nothing but his car and the clothes on his back, he faced an impossible developmental situation. Adolescents typically navigate the transition to adulthood with family support, educational opportunities, and social safety nets. Stan had none of these. He had no high school diploma, no job skills, no financial resources, no family support, and no legitimate path forward. A psychologist would recognize that turning to crime under these circumstances represents rational adaptation to impossible constraints rather than pure moral deficiency. Stan's first criminal venture appears to have been treasure hunting on beaches, looking for valuable items to sell. When this proved insufficiently profitable, he founded Stan Company Enterprises, selling various fraudulent products. The sham total towels that made stains worse rather than cleaning them. The rip-off bandages that gave users rashes instead of protecting wounds. The Stan-Vac vacuum cleaners that barely functioned. Every product was fundamentally fraudulent, designed to extract money through deception. A psychologist analyzing these early cons would note several psychologically significant patterns. First, the cons were relatively small-scale and targeted individual consumers rather than large institutions, suggesting Stan lacked the sophistication and connections for more elaborate crimes. Second, the cons were poorly executed and frequently failed, resulting in angry mobs and arrests, suggesting Stan was driven more by desperation than by natural criminal talent. Third, the cons required constant movement and identity changes to avoid consequences, preventing stable life or genuine relationships. The show depicts Stan being chased by angry mobs repeatedly, arrested in multiple jurisdictions, and eventually banned from 32 states due to his criminal activities. He accumulated a record that included tax evasion, fraud, theft, assault, identity fraud, and numerous other offenses. A psychologist would observe that this extensive criminal record served to make Stan's outcast identity permanent and legitimate paths increasingly impossible. Each arrest and ban narrowed his options further, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where crime became increasingly necessary for survival. Stan's time in Colombian prison, where he accumulated debt to dangerous criminals like Rico, represented a low point in his criminal career. The show doesn't detail what crime landed him in foreign prison, but it was serious enough for international incarceration. A psychologist would note that prison time, especially in foreign prisons known for harsh conditions, typically represents significant trauma that can either deter future crime or deepen criminal identity depending on circumstances. For Stan, it appears to have deepened his criminal connections and skills. Throughout these years, Stan created multiple false identities: Stetson Pinefield, Hal Forrester, Andrew 8-Ball Alcatraz, Steve Pinnington, and others. These weren't just aliases for practical purposes. They represented alternative versions of self that Stan could inhabit when Stanley Pines became too dangerous or painful. A psychologist would recognize this pattern of multiple identities as psychologically significant, suggesting identity fragmentation and difficulty maintaining coherent sense of self. The creation of false identities served multiple psychological functions. Practically, they allowed Stan to operate in states where Stanley Pines was banned or wanted. Psychologically, they allowed distance from the shameful, rejected identity of the real Stanley Pines. Each false identity could be someone different, someone who wasn't the failure and screw-up his father had labeled him. A psychologist might observe this as dissociative strategy, where the pain of being Stanley Pines was managed by simply not being Stanley Pines. Stan's eventual decision to fake his own death and assume Ford's identity represented the ultimate expression of this pattern. Stanley Pines, the rejected failure who cost his family millions, could literally die. Stanford Pines, the successful researcher, could be inhabited as protective shell. A psychologist would note the psychological complexity of assuming your twin's identity. It's both ultimate closeness, becoming the person you love, and ultimate distance, not existing as yourself. Living as Stanford Pines for 30 years while running the Mystery Shack represented Stan's most sustained and sophisticated con. He convinced an entire town that he was someone he wasn't. He maintained the deception through countless interactions, close relationships, and challenging situations. This required extraordinary cognitive abilities, including excellent memory for false narratives, quick adaptive thinking, and emotional control. A psychologist would observe that Stan's intelligence and strategic thinking, which could have served legitimate success, were instead applied to maintaining an elaborate lie. The Mystery Shack itself represented Stan's con artistry refined and professionalized. Unlike his early failed ventures, the Mystery Shack was a successful ongoing business that generated sustainable income. Stan had learned from decades of failure and developed a more sophisticated approach. The fake attractions were obvious enough that customers participated knowingly in the deception, making it more entertainment than pure fraud. The business model was sustainable because Stan delivered experience and story, not just fake products. A psychologist analyzing the Mystery Shack would note how it represented maturation of Stan's criminal skills. Rather than running cons that inevitably failed and required escape, Stan created stable business that operated in quasi-legal gray area. Rather than pure deception that generated anger when exposed, Stan delivered entertainment that customers enjoyed despite recognizing its falseness. This showed significant psychological and strategic development from his earlier crude cons. Stan's attitude toward his marks revealed important psychological patterns. He called tourists the dumbest people in the world and showed contempt for their gullibility. This contempt served defensive function. If the people he conned were stupid and deserving of exploitation, Stan didn't need to feel guilty about taking their money. A psychologist would recognize this as moral disengagement, where Stan justified his behavior by devaluing his victims. However, Stan's contempt may also have contained an element of projection. Stan himself had been gullible and easily deceived in his youth, trusting Ford and his father only to be betrayed and rejected. Calling others dumb for trusting may have been a way of disowning his own painful experiences of misplaced trust. A psychologist would observe that we often judge harshly in others the qualities we most despise in ourselves. Stan's relationship with money throughout the series revealed the psychological wounds driving his criminal behavior. He was extremely cheap, obsessed with maximizing profit, and engaged in extensive tax evasion and financial fraud. Surface analysis might label this as simple greed, but deeper psychological examination reveals trauma-based insecurity. Stan had been rejected for costing the family millions. He had experienced poverty so severe he lived in his car. Money represented security, worth, and proof that he wasn't the financial burden his father had labeled him. The show revealed that despite his cheapness in daily operations, Stan spent enormous resources on the Portal project. The electricity consumption alone would have been massive. The equipment and materials were expensive. A psychologist would observe that Stan's financial behavior was not driven by consistent philosophy of wealth accumulation, but by specific psychological needs. He was cheap with others to maintain security, but willing to spend everything on his redemption project of saving Ford. Stan's criminal skills proved unexpectedly valuable throughout the series. His ability to pick locks, hotwire cars, create fake IDs, and navigate illegal networks saved the family repeatedly. His understanding of scams and deception made him uniquely qualified to recognize when others were being manipulated. His extensive criminal contacts provided resources in crisis situations. A psychologist would note the irony that skills developed through trauma and rejection ultimately served heroic purposes. The Stanturian candidate showed Stan running for mayor despite his extensive criminal record. When his record was discovered, it disqualified him from office. The episode revealed the permanent consequences of Stan's criminal past. No matter what heroic actions he performed or how much he changed, his record remained. A psychologist would observe this as representing how trauma-driven choices can have lifelong consequences that persist even after healing and growth. Stan's relationship to legitimate authority throughout his life was characterized by contempt and rebellion. He evaded taxes, ignored regulations, bribed officials, and generally operated outside legal systems whenever possible. A psychologist would recognize this as stemming partly from his expulsion from family authority, partly from decades of operating criminally, and partly from justified cynicism about authorities who had never protected or supported him. However, Stan's contempt for authority coexisted with occasional appeals to authority when strategically useful. He called the police when it served his purposes. He used legal systems to his advantage when possible. He understood how authority structures worked well enough to manipulate them. A psychologist would observe that Stan's relationship with authority was instrumental rather than principled. He didn't respect authority, but he understood how to use it. Stan's criminal identity also provided psychological benefits beyond material survival. It gave him identity and competence in domain where he could succeed. He was genuinely skilled at cons, deception, and navigating illegal worlds. This provided sense of mastery and capability that legitimate endeavors had never offered. A psychologist would note that humans need to feel competent and effective, and Stan found those feelings through criminal success after being denied them through legitimate channels. The criminal identity also protected Stan from vulnerability of trying and failing at legitimate success. If you never try to succeed legitimately, you never risk the shame of legitimate failure. If you embrace outlaw identity, rejection by legitimate society can't hurt you the same way. You've already rejected them first. A psychologist would recognize this as defensive strategy, where Stan protected himself from potential rejection by preemptively rejecting the systems and people who might reject him. However, the criminal identity carried significant costs. It prevented genuine relationships based on honesty. It created constant stress of maintaining deceptions and avoiding consequences. It reinforced Stan's sense of himself as fundamentally flawed and unworthy of legitimate belonging. It required constant vigilance and prevented rest or genuine security. A psychologist would observe that the defensive benefits of criminal identity came with substantial psychological toll. Stan's criminal skills were ultimately most significant for how they enabled his heroic sacrifice. Only someone with Stan's expertise in deception could have fooled Bill Cipher into entering the wrong mind. Only someone with Stan's understanding of cons and scams could have recognized Bill's manipulation and developed effective counter-strategy. Only someone who had spent decades wearing false identities could have successfully pretended to be Ford at the crucial moment. A psychologist would observe the profound irony and psychological significance of this. Stan's criminal skills, developed through trauma, rejection, and decades of defensive adaptation, became the tools that saved the universe. The very patterns that had been labeled as proof of his worthlessness were what made him uniquely valuable. His father had been wrong. Stan's path, however painful and destructive, had led to capabilities that no one else possessed. The show's resolution allowed Stan to finally leave his criminal identity behind. With the mystery shack in Seuss's capable hands, his relationship with Ford repaired, and his heroism recognized, Stan could finally stop running cons and living under false identities. He could sail the world with Ford as himself, Stanley Pines, rather than as a criminal or as his twin. A psychologist would recognize this as representing integration and healing, where Stan no longer needed defensive criminal identity to survive or to have worth. However, the show also suggested that Stan's con artist skills and street smarts remained part of who he was. The final scenes showed Stan and Ford encountering anomalies at sea, with Stan presumably using his full skill set, including criminal expertise. A psychologist would observe that healing doesn't mean erasing the skills developed through trauma. It means integrating them into healthier overall identity where they serve rather than dominate. Stan's criminal career revealed how trauma and rejection can create psychological patterns that persist for decades, how survival strategies can become identity, and how defensive adaptations can simultaneously protect and imprison. It also revealed that skills developed through pain can ultimately serve redemption, that there are multiple paths to worth and capability, and that even the most destructive patterns can be transformed through love and purpose. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Stan's criminal identity served as armor against rejection and vulnerability. Yet this same identity prevented him from experiencing the genuine connection and belonging he desperately needed. A psychologist observing Stanley Pines throughout Gravity Falls would identify a consistent pattern of extreme emotional guardedness, where Stan systematically avoided vulnerability, deflected genuine emotional expression, and performed exaggerated masculinity as defense against the softness and need that he believed made him weak and worthy of rejection. This emotional armor, developed through decades of trauma and survival, protected Stan from further hurt, but also prevented the authentic connection he desperately craved. Stan's characteristic communication style involved gruffness, sarcasm, dismissal, and deflection. When faced with sincere emotional moments, Stan typically responded with jokes, changed the subject, or turned vulnerability into a lesson about toughness. When Dipper or Mabel tried to have genuine emotional conversations, Stan deflected with comments like, "Don't be a wimp," or "Toughen up, kid." A psychologist would recognize these patterns as defensive avoidance of emotional intimacy. The few occasions when Stan expressed genuine emotion directly were notable precisely because they were so rare. Stan rarely said, "I love you" to anyone. He rarely admitted fear, sadness, or vulnerability. He rarely acknowledged his own needs or pain. A psychologist would observe that Stan had internalized a rigid model of masculinity where emotional expression equaled weakness, and weakness equaled unworthiness and rejection. This model likely originated in Stan's childhood with Philbrick. The show depicted Philbrick as emotionally distant and stern, someone who valued toughness and practical achievement over emotional expression. Philbrick's response to the twins being bullied was to enroll them in boxing lessons, teaching them to fight rather than addressing the emotional impact of bullying. The message was clear: real men handle problems through physical toughness, not emotional processing. Stan internalized this message and amplified it through his decades of survival on society's margins. In the criminal underworld and during periods of homelessness, emotional vulnerability could indeed be dangerous. Showing weakness could invite exploitation or attack. Stan learned that gruff toughness kept people at distance and prevented vulnerability that might be weaponized against him. A psychologist would recognize this as adaptive in dangerous contexts, but maladaptive in safe relationships where vulnerability enables connection. Stan's physical presentation reinforced his defensive masculinity. He wore tank tops that showed his muscular arms despite being elderly. He maintained his boxing skills and demonstrated willingness to fight when challenged. He performed stereotypical masculine behaviors like watching boxing matches, drinking heavily at times, and engaging in crude humor. A psychologist would observe these as performance of traditional masculinity designed to project strength and hide vulnerability. However, beneath this performance, the show revealed Stan's deep capacity for tender emotion. He kept photos of Dipper and Mabel on his desk. He teared up during emotional movies when he thought no one was watching. He created elaborate schemes to give the twins positive experiences and protect them from harm. He sacrificed everything for Ford despite their conflicts. A psychologist would note that Stan's emotional capacity was profound, but carefully hidden behind defensive exterior. Stan's relationship with romantic vulnerability showed similar patterns. The show referenced Stan having an ex-wife named Marilyn, though details were minimal. His past relationship with Carla Hot Pants McCorkle in high school ended with her leaving him for someone else. In Legend of the Gobblewonker, Stan tried unsuccessfully to connect with various women at the lake. These glimpses suggested Stan had difficulty with romantic intimacy and had experienced rejection in romantic contexts as well as familial. A psychologist would observe that someone with Stan's attachment wounds would likely struggle with romantic relationships. The vulnerability required for romantic intimacy would trigger fears of rejection. The potential for abandonment would activate old wounds. Stan's defensive patterns would prevent the openness required for healthy romantic bonding. His identity confusion and decades of deception would make authentic romantic connection nearly impossible. Stan's emotional guardedness created particular complications in his parenting-style relationship with Dipper and Mabel. He wanted to express his love and care for them, but struggled to do so directly. His attempts at emotional connection often came out as gruff lessons or awkward gestures rather than straightforward affection. A psychologist would note that Stan lacked models for healthy emotional expression, having grown up with an emotionally distant father and having spent decades in isolation. The Legend of the Gobblewonker revealed Stan's vulnerability around rejection by the twins. When they ditched him to hunt monsters with Seuss, Stan spent the day trying desperately to find alternative companionship, being rejected by everyone. The episode showed Stan's profound loneliness and his fear that even these children who were supposed to be spending summer with him would prefer anyone else's company. His hurt response when they returned showed how much their acceptance mattered, though he tried to hide it. Stan's teaching approach with Dipper revealed his beliefs about masculinity and emotion. He frequently mocked Dipper's voice cracks, his physical weakness, and his emotional sensitivity. Stan seemed to believe he was helping Dipper by toughening him up, teaching him not to show vulnerability that others might exploit. A psychologist would recognize that Stan was repeating patterns from his own upbringing, trying to prepare Dipper for a harsh world by making him emotionally armored. However, this approach risked damaging Dipper's self-esteem and emotional development in ways similar to how Stan himself had been damaged. Making fun of normal developmental changes like voice cracks shames natural processes. Mocking emotional sensitivity teaches that feelings should be hidden rather than processed. Teaching constant vigilance against exploitation prevents trust and authentic connection. A psychologist would observe that trauma patterns often repeat across generations when unexamined. Stan's relationship with Ford brought his emotional guardedness into sharp relief. The twins loved each other profoundly, but struggled to express it directly. Their arguments were often about surface issues while avoiding deeper emotional truths. Stan couldn't directly say, "I missed you," or "I need you to acknowledge my sacrifice." Ford couldn't say, "I'm sorry for abandoning you," or "I was wrong to accuse you." Instead, they bickered about grammar and safety protocols. A psychologist would recognize this as characteristic of people who lack skills for healthy emotional expression. When you haven't learned to identify, express, and negotiate emotions directly, conflict becomes proxy for emotional communication. Arguments about trivial matters carry weight of unexpressed deeper feelings. Resentment builds because actual needs remain unspoken and therefore unmet. The imprisoned conversation between Stan and Ford in Weirdmageddon Part 3 represented Stan's most vulnerable emotional expression in the entire series. He directly stated his deepest fear. "Dad was right about me. I'm the screw-up who ruins everything." This acknowledgement of his core wound, the internalized belief in his own worthlessness, represented breakthrough vulnerability that Stan had avoided for 40 years. A psychologist would observe how crisis created space for this vulnerability. When facing potential death and universal destruction, normal defenses became irrelevant. The urgency and danger stripped away the protective layers that Stan maintained in ordinary circumstances. This allowed genuine emotional truth to emerge in ways that normal safety and routine didn't permit. Ford's response, validating Stan's worth and acknowledging his own mistakes, provided exactly what Stan's wounded psyche needed. Ford recognized Stan's intelligence and street smarts, explicitly stating Stan would have seen through Bill's deception immediately. This acknowledgement that Stan possessed valuable capabilities Ford lacked offered corrective experience to decades of feeling inferior and inadequate. Stan's willingness to sacrifice his memories and identity to defeat Bill represented the ultimate expression of love beneath his emotional guardedness. Despite his defensive armor, despite his decades of self-protection, Stan chose the vulnerability of complete self-loss to protect others. A psychologist would recognize this as revealing Stan's authentic emotional core. Beneath all the armor and performance was someone capable of profound love and selfless sacrifice. The memory erasure and recovery sequence forced Stan into complete vulnerability. Without memories, he had no defenses, no protective armor, no strategic calculations. He was simply present with genuine confusion and need. The show depicted the family responding with patient love, working to restore his memories through shared experiences and emotional connection. A psychologist would note that this represented Stan receiving care in state of complete vulnerability, an experience he had avoided throughout his adult life. When Stan's memories gradually returned, his defensive patterns returned with them. He resumed his gruff demeanor, his deflection of emotional moments, his performance of toughness. However, the show suggested that something fundamental had shifted. Stan had experienced both complete vulnerability and unconditional acceptance. He had been loved in state of utter helplessness. This created possibility for less defended existence even as old patterns re-emerged. Stan's decision to sail the world with Ford on the Stan O-War 2 represented choice to prioritize relationship and shared dreams over defensive isolation. Rather than maintaining emotional distance or pursuing separate paths, Stan chose intimate ongoing connection with the person he loved most. A psychologist would recognize this as representing significant psychological growth, where Stan could risk the vulnerability of close relationship despite fears of rejection or abandonment. However, the show also suggested that Stan's emotional guardedness would likely persist as a lifelong pattern even with healing. Decades of defensive habits don't disappear simply because circumstances improve. Stan would probably always be more comfortable with gruff deflection than direct emotional expression. He would probably always struggle with vulnerability and tend toward defensive performance of toughness. A psychologist would observe that healing doesn't mean becoming a different person. It means integrating painful experiences while developing capacity for greater flexibility and authenticity. Stan's masculine performance throughout the series revealed how traditional masculinity can serve as defensive armor, how emotional guardedness protects against further hurt while preventing genuine connection, and how trauma can create rigid patterns that persist even when circumstances no longer require them. It also revealed that beneath even the most defended exterior can exist profound capacity for love, that vulnerability in crisis can create healing breakthroughs, and that authentic connection requires risk of the very rejection that defenses were designed to prevent. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Stan's emotional guardedness protected him from vulnerability, but also prevented the genuine intimacy he needed, creating a tragic cycle where the defenses that kept him safe also kept him lonely. A psychologist examining Stanley Pine's behavior throughout Gravity Falls would identify a powerful pattern of self-sacrifice driven by what might be termed a redemption complex, a psychological compulsion to atone for perceived sins through increasingly extreme acts of self-abnegation. Stan's entire adult life was structured around sacrificing himself to save Ford, to prove his worth, and to earn back the belonging that had been taken from him. This pattern revealed both Stan's capacity for profound love and the psychological wounds that made him believe love must be earned through suffering rather than simply received. The redemption complex began the moment Stan accidentally pushed Ford through the portal. Standing in the basement, facing the deactivated portal and the horrifying reality that his twin was gone, Stan made a decision that would define the next 30 years. He would bring Ford back no matter how long it took, no matter what it cost, no matter what he had to sacrifice. A psychologist would recognize this decision as driven by multiple psychological needs operating simultaneously. First, and most obviously, Stan loved Ford and was devastated by losing him. The grief and horror of that moment would be overwhelming. Second, Stan felt guilty about both the science fair incident and the portal accident, even though both were largely accidental. This guilt demanded atonement. Third, Stan believed that rescuing Ford would finally prove his worth and earn Ford's love and acceptance. Fourth, Stan's identity was so fused with Ford that losing Ford meant losing himself, making rescue psychologically necessary for Stan's own sense of existence. A psychologist would observe that Stan's decision to sacrifice everything for Ford's rescue revealed his core psychological pattern. When faced with loss or rejection, respond with extreme self-sacrifice designed to prove worth and earn back what was lost. This pattern likely originated in the original family rejection, where Stan learned that his worth was conditional and must be earned through service to Ford's success. The decision to assume Ford's identity represented the most extreme form of self-sacrifice Stan could make. He literally erased Stanley Pines from existence, faking his own death and becoming Stanford Pines. A psychologist would note the symbolic significance. The rejected, worthless Stanley could die while the valuable Stanford could be inhabited as vehicle for redemption. Stan sacrificed not just his time and resources, but his very identity and existence. Living as Ford for 30 years required Stan to maintain constant vigilance and deception. Every interaction required remembering he was supposed to be Stanford. Every relationship was built on lies. Every moment contained risk of exposure. The psychological toll of this sustained deception would be immense. A psychologist would observe that Stan chose isolation and constant stress as price for his redemption project. The portal project itself required extraordinary sacrifice. Stan taught himself advanced physics and engineering despite having no formal education beyond high school. He worked obsessively for 30 years, often sleeping in his study surrounded by research materials. He spent enormous financial resources keeping the portal operational. He risked his life working with dangerous machinery and barely understood forces. A psychologist would note that Stan demonstrated remarkable intelligence, determination, and capability, all in service of self-sacrificial redemption. The show revealed through background details just how consuming Stan's portal project was. The basement laboratory was elaborate and extensive. The research materials filled multiple rooms. The machinery was complex and dangerous. Stan had essentially become a self-taught physicist and engineer, while simultaneously running the Mystery Shack to fund the project. A psychologist would observe that Stan's intelligence and capability were extraordinary, making it even more tragic that he believed himself worthless and needing to prove his value through suffering. Stan's relationship with Dipper and Mabel during this time revealed how his redemption complex affected his capacity for present-moment connection. Even while caring for the twins and developing genuine love for them, Stan remained psychologically consumed by his portal project. His primary emotional energy was directed towards saving Ford rather than fully engaging with the children in his care. A psychologist would note that trauma-driven compulsions can prevent full presence even in important relationships. However, the twins' presence also created conflict in Stan's redemption complex. As he grew to love Dipper and Mabel, Stan faced increasing moral tension about the risks his portal project posed. The portal could potentially destroy the universe, endangering the twins and everyone else. Yet, Stan couldn't abandon the project that had defined his existence for 3 decades. A psychologist would observe that Stan was trapped between competing psychological needs, protecting his family versus completing his redemption. Not what he seems brought this tension to crisis. Government agents arrived to arrest Stan and shut down the portal, just as it was approaching activation after 30 years of work. Dipper discovered Stan's lies and faced a choice. Trust Stan and let the portal continue, or protect everyone by shutting it down. The episode revealed Stan's desperation as decades of sacrifice approached either completion or futility. The moment when Mabel chose to trust Stan and press the button represented profound psychological significance for Stan's redemption complex. Mabel accepted Stan despite not understanding his motivations. She trusted that beneath all the lies, Stan loved them and wouldn't truly endanger them. A psychologist would note that this represented the kind of unconditional acceptance Stan had sought his entire life, being trusted and valued despite imperfection and without needing to explain or justify himself. When Ford emerged from the portal, Stan expected his 30 years of sacrifice to be recognized and appreciated. He expected Ford to be grateful, to acknowledge the extraordinary dedication Stan had demonstrated, to finally validate Stan's worth. Instead, Ford was immediately angry about the risks Stan had taken. He focused on the danger of activating the portal rather than on the sacrifice Stan had made. A psychologist would recognize this as profoundly re-traumatizing for Stan. Once again, his enormous efforts were dismissed, his sacrifices unrecognized, his worth denied. Stan's response to Ford's ingratitude revealed important aspects of his redemption complex. He became defensive and angry, insisting Ford acknowledge what he'd given up. He listed his sacrifices. "I gave up 30 years of my life for you." His anger showed that the sacrifices had not been purely selfless. They were investments that Stan expected would yield return in form of Ford's love and appreciation. A psychologist would observe that Stan's self-sacrifice contained elements of both genuine love and transactional thinking, where suffering should be rewarded with acceptance. The continued conflict between Stan and Ford throughout Season 2 revealed that Stan's redemption project had failed to achieve its psychological purpose. He had saved Ford, proven his capability, and demonstrated extraordinary dedication. Yet he still felt unworthy, still felt unappreciated, still sought validation that Ford couldn't or wouldn't provide. A psychologist would note that external accomplishments cannot heal internal wounds of self-worth. Stan's redemption complex was based on false premise that right achievement would finally make him worthy. However, Stan's capacity for self-sacrifice extended beyond his relationship with Ford. Throughout the series, Stan consistently prioritized others' safety and well-being over his own. He took physical risks to protect Dipper and Mabel. He sacrificed his business and home to keep them safe. He put himself between the children and danger repeatedly. A psychologist would observe that Stan's self-sacrificial patterns appeared in all his important relationships, suggesting deep-seated belief that his worth depended on what he could do for others. The Stanturian candidate showed Stan running for mayor partially to protect the town and partially to prove himself to the community. When his criminal record disqualified him, Stan experienced this as another rejection despite his good intentions and his heroic actions saving Dipper and Mabel during the campaign. A psychologist would note that Stan kept trying to earn acceptance and worth through service and sacrifice, repeatedly experiencing that external validation cannot heal internal wounds. Stan's ultimate sacrifice came in Weirdmageddon Part 3, when he volunteered to have his memories erased to defeat Bill Cipher. After a lifetime of sacrificing for Ford and others, Stan made the ultimate sacrifice: his very self, his memories, his identity. A psychologist would recognize this as the culmination of Stan's redemption complex. He was willing to lose everything, including who he was, to save the people he loved. The plan required Stan and Ford to switch clothes, so Bill would enter Stan's mind thinking it was Ford's. Stan had to maintain the deception even against a psychic demon who could read thoughts. Then Ford would use the memory gun to erase Stan's mind, destroying Bill along with Stan's memories and identity. A psychologist would observe multiple layers of psychological significance in this plan. First, Stan once again assumed Ford's identity, recapitulating the pattern he'd lived for 30 years. Second, Stan used his expertise in deception, skills developed through trauma and survival, to save everyone. Third, Stan chose to lose his memories and self for others' survival, the ultimate expression of his belief that his worth came from what he sacrificed rather than who he was. Fourth, the plan required Ford to trust Stan completely, finally acknowledging Stan's unique value. Stan's behavior as he prepared for memory erasure revealed his acceptance of this ultimate sacrifice. He didn't hesitate or express fear about losing himself. He focused on taunting Bill and ensuring the plan worked. His final conscious thought as Stan Pines was punching Bill's physical form while saying, "Ha! It's funny. I was so terrible at everything in my life, but I come up here and I'm like some kind of Superman or something." A psychologist would note the profound sadness in this. Even in his moment of ultimate heroism, Stan believed he had been terrible at everything. The The memory erasure represented Stan's redemption complex reaching its ultimate expression and simultaneously its destruction. Stan sacrificed everything to save others, finally proving his worth in most definitive way possible. Yet, in that very moment, he lost the ability to know he had proved anything. He saved the universe, but would never know his own heroism. A psychologist would observe the tragic irony. Stan finally achieved the validation and worth he'd sought for 40 years, but lost himself in the process. Ford's anguish as he prepared to erase Stan's mind revealed how completely Ford's perspective had transformed. He openly acknowledged Stan as their hero. He expressed devastating grief about erasing Stan's memories. He wished he could tell Stan that Stan had saved the world. A psychologist would note that Ford was finally offering the recognition and validation Stan had desperately needed, but offering it at the moment when Stan would lose capacity to receive it. Stan's mindscape during the memory erasure showed Stan's final resistance to losing himself. His mental representation appeared, trying to hold onto memories as they were destroyed. The mindscape Stan's final words before erasure were about protecting his family. His last thoughts centered on love and protection, rather than on self-preservation. A psychologist would observe that even in the moment of ego death, Stan's core identity was defined by protecting and sacrificing for others. When Stan woke without memories, he represented pure being without identity, defenses, or redemption complexes. He didn't know who he was, what he'd done, or what he'd sacrificed. In this state, he was simply present, vulnerable, and real. A psychologist would note that the memory erasure stripped away all the psychological structures Stan had built around his trauma, leaving him in state of complete openness. The family's efforts to restore Stan's memories through Mabel's scrapbook and shared experiences represented love offered to Stan in his most vulnerable state. They didn't love him for what he'd accomplished or sacrificed. They loved him simply as himself, working to bring him back not because they needed him to save them, but because they wanted him to exist. A psychologist would recognize this as the kind of unconditional love Stan had needed his entire life. Stan's gradual memory recovery showed that identity and self are not easily erased. The deepest patterns, his protectiveness, his humor, his connection to family, persisted even without explicit memories. When Waddles licked him and Stan automatically called the pig by name, despite having no conscious memory, it demonstrated that love and connection existed at levels deeper than conscious memory. A psychologist would note this as symbolically representing that Stan's core self, his capacity for love, survived even ultimate sacrifice. When Stan's memories fully returned, the family celebrated not his heroism or sacrifice, but simply his existence. Ford hugged him and called him their hero, but the emphasis was on having Stan back rather than on what Stan had done. Dipper and Mabel celebrated because they loved him, not because he'd saved them. A psychologist would observe that Stan finally received love for being rather than for doing, the unconditional acceptance he'd sought through decades of sacrifice. The resolution of Stan's redemption complex came through the memory erasure and recovery. Stan had proven his worth in most extreme way possible, sacrificing his very self for others. But the healing came not from the sacrifice itself, but from experiencing unconditional love during vulnerability and recovery. The family loved Stan back to himself not because he'd earned it through suffering, but because they simply loved him. After the memory recovery, Stan no longer needed to prove his worth through sacrifice. He had been fully known, his lies, his crimes, his failures, his sacrifices, everything, and fully loved. He had experienced ultimate vulnerability and received unconditional acceptance. A psychologist would recognize this as providing corrective emotional experience that could begin healing his core wounds around conditional worth. Stan's decision to sail the world with Ford represented choosing relationship and shared joy rather than continuing patterns of self-sacrifice for redemption. Rather than sacrificing for Ford, Stan was choosing to be with Ford in mutual pursuit of shared dreams. A psychologist would observe this as representing a healthier relationship pattern where both people's needs and desires matter equally. However, the show also suggested that Stan's self-sacrificial patterns would likely persist as part of who he was. His instinct to protect others, his willingness to take risks for people he loved, his tendency to prioritize others' needs, these patterns were too deeply ingrained to simply disappear. A psychologist would note that healing doesn't mean becoming selfless, it means integrating self-sacrificial capacity into healthier overall identity where self-care and other care can coexist. Stan's redemption complex revealed how trauma can create compulsive patterns of self-sacrifice, how the belief that worth must be earned through suffering can drive decades of behavior, and how external accomplishments cannot heal internal wounds. It also revealed that genuine healing comes not from successful redemption, but from experiencing unconditional love, that vulnerability can create space for receiving acceptance, and that the ultimate sacrifice paradoxically enabled Stan to receive the unconditional love he'd always needed. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Stan's pattern of self-sacrifice revealed his profound capacity for love, while simultaneously showing how trauma had taught him that love must be earned through suffering rather than simply received as his birthright. A psychologist, observing Stanley Pines throughout Gravity Falls, would identify a striking contradiction between Stan's self-perception as an uneducated failure and his demonstrated extraordinary intelligence across multiple domains. Stan taught himself advanced physics and engineering, maintained elaborate deceptions for decades, strategically navigated complex social situations, and ultimately outsmarted a psychic demon through pure cunning. This contradiction between perceived and actual intelligence reveals how deeply Stan had internalized his father's judgment and how trauma can prevent people from recognizing their own capabilities. Stan's formal education ended in high school, which he barely passed. He was not an academic achiever like Ford, struggled with conventional schooling, and left his education with no credentials or qualifications. In a family that valued intellectual achievement, Stan's academic struggles marked him as less intelligent, less valuable, and less worthy than his genius twin. A psychologist would recognize how educational systems often fail to recognize multiple forms of intelligence, particularly when comparing conventional academic success with other cognitive strengths. However, Stan's demonstrated intelligence throughout the series was remarkable. After Ford disappeared through the portal, Stan found himself alone with Ford's research journals containing advanced physics, complex mathematics, and sophisticated engineering concepts. Stan had no formal training in any of these areas. Yet, over the following months and years, Stan taught himself enough physics and engineering to understand the portal's mechanics, maintain its complex systems, and eventually reactivate it successfully. A psychologist would observe that self-teaching advanced physics and engineering represents extraordinary cognitive ability. Stan had to process abstract mathematical concepts, understand complex theoretical frameworks, and apply this knowledge to practical engineering problems. He had to troubleshoot sophisticated machinery, solve technical challenges, and make the portal operational despite its dangerous and barely understood technology. These accomplishments required high intelligence, strong analytical thinking, and remarkable determination. The fact that Stan accomplished this while maintaining his cover as Stanford Pines, running the Mystery Shack as a business, and eventually caring for Dipper and Mabel demonstrates exceptional cognitive capacity for managing multiple complex demands simultaneously. A psychologist would note that executive functioning skills, planning, organizing, multitasking, and sustained focus were all highly developed in Stan despite his lack of formal education. Stan's social intelligence was perhaps even more remarkable than his technical intelligence. He maintained the false identity of Stanford Pines for 30 years, convincing an entire town that he was someone he wasn't. This required extraordinary abilities in reading people, adapting his behavior to match expectations, constructing and maintaining consistent false narratives, and managing the cognitive load of remembering extensive fabricated history. A psychologist analyzing Stan's social intelligence would note several sophisticated capabilities. First, Stan could read people quickly and accurately, identifying their beliefs, expectations, and vulnerabilities. Second, he could adapt his presentation strategically to manipulate how others perceived him. Third, he maintained excellent memory for his false narratives, avoiding contradictions that would expose the deception. Fourth, he managed the emotional regulation necessary to lie convincingly without revealing stress or guilt. Stan's con artist career, while ethically problematic, demonstrated high strategic intelligence. Successful cons require understanding human psychology, predicting behavior, identifying vulnerabilities, and executing complex plans with precise timing. Stan's ability to create the Mystery Shack as sustainable business showed learning from his early failed cons and developing more sophisticated approach. A psychologist would observe that Stan possessed entrepreneurial intelligence in addition to his social and technical abilities. The Mystery Shack itself revealed Stan's creative intelligence and business acumen. He transformed Ford's research house into profitable tourist attraction by identifying what would appeal to tourists, creating compelling, if fake, exhibits, and developing entertaining presentation style. He understood supply and demand, priced strategically to maximize profit, and built sustainable business model. A psychologist would note that these accomplishments required market analysis, creative thinking, and strategic planning. Stan's criminal expertise demonstrated another form of intelligence often unrecognized by conventional metrics. He knew how to pick locks, hotwire cars, create convincing fake IDs, navigate illegal networks, evade law enforcement, and operate successfully in underground economy. These skills required procedural learning, risk assessment, strategic thinking, and social navigation in dangerous contexts. A psychologist would observe that criminal expertise, while applied to problematic ends, represents genuine cognitive capability. Stan's strategic thinking appeared throughout the series in how he approached challenges. When facing problems, Stan quickly assessed situations, identified available resources, developed plans with multiple contingencies, and executed with decisive action. In Gideon Rises, when Gideon took over the Mystery Shack, Stan developed an elaborate plan to reclaim it, involving multiple moving parts and precise timing. A psychologist would recognize this as demonstrating strong strategic and tactical intelligence. Stan's understanding of deception and manipulation made him uniquely qualified to recognize when others were being deceived. He immediately recognized Bill Cipher as a dangerous threat when others were fooled by Bill's charm. He understood Gideon's manipulative tactics because they resembled his own. He saw through various cons and schemes throughout the series because he understood the psychology of deception. A psychologist would note that Stan's expertise in lying made him expert at detecting lies. The plan to defeat Bill Cipher in Weirdmageddon Part 3 demonstrated Stan's intelligence in its most heroic application. The plan required Stan to deceive a psychic demon who could read thoughts and see through deceptions. Stan succeeded by using his lifetime of experience with false identities and his understanding that Bill's arrogance was his weakness. Stan knew Bill would be too confident to thoroughly verify he was in the right mind. A psychologist would observe that Stan's intelligence had developed through decades of trauma and survival, ultimately served to save everyone. Stan's quick thinking and adaptability appeared in crisis situations throughout the series. When faced with unexpected challenges, Stan rarely panicked. He assessed the new situation rapidly, adjusted his plans, and found creative solutions using available resources. This cognitive flexibility, the ability to think on your feet and adapt to changing circumstances, represents an important form of intelligence that standardized tests don't measure. A psychologist would recognize this as characteristic of high fluid intelligence. Stan's emotional intelligence, while impaired by his defensive patterns, was more sophisticated than he received credit for. He understood what motivated people, could predict their reactions, and knew how to influence their emotions and behavior. He recognized the twins' individual needs and adjusted his approach accordingly. He understood Ford's psychology well enough to know exactly how to annoy him and exactly how to appeal to him. A psychologist would observe that emotional intelligence existed in Stan despite his difficulty expressing his own emotions healthily. Stan's practical intelligence, the kind that helps solve real-world problems, was exceptional. He could fix broken machinery, improvise solutions with limited resources, and handle practical challenges that stumped more formally educated people. When the Mystery Shack needed repairs, Stan did them himself. When equipment broke, Stan figured out how to fix it. This practical problem-solving ability represents an important form of intelligence that academic settings often undervalue. A psychologist would observe that Stan demonstrated what Howard Gardner called multiple intelligences, various forms of cognitive capability that conventional IQ tests don't fully capture. Stan showed high logical mathematical intelligence in learning physics and engineering. He demonstrated exceptional interpersonal intelligence in reading and manipulating people. He displayed strong bodily kinesthetic intelligence in his fighting skills and practical work. He showed creative intelligence in his cons and business innovations. The contrast between Stan's actual intelligence and his internalized self-perception as the dumb twin revealed the psychological damage of early labeling. Because Ford was recognized as genius, Stan was implicitly categorized as not genius, which became translated in family dynamics as stupid or inadequate. A psychologist would recognize how damaging such comparisons can be, especially when one child is identified as exceptional, making the other feel deficient by comparison. Stan's line in his final moment before memory erasure, "I was so terrible at everything in my life," demonstrated how completely he had internalized the belief in his own inadequacy despite overwhelming evidence of his capabilities. A psychologist would observe this as a tragic example of how early wounds to self-worth can persist despite contradictory evidence. Stan had accomplished extraordinary things requiring remarkable intelligence, yet he believed he was terrible at everything. The show suggested that Stan's intelligence developed partly through necessity and adversity. Faced with impossible challenges, surviving alone at 17, teaching himself advanced physics, maintaining elaborate deception for 30 years, Stan developed capabilities he might never have discovered in comfortable circumstances. A psychologist would note that adversity can indeed foster capability development, though this doesn't justify the trauma that created the necessity. However, the show also suggested that Stan's intelligence was always present, but unrecognized by systems that valued only conventional academic achievement. Stan's quick wit, social perceptiveness, practical problem-solving, and strategic thinking were evident even in childhood. But these forms of intelligence weren't valued in his family or educational environment. A psychologist would observe how tragically common this pattern is. Children with genuine cognitive gifts being labeled as failures because their intelligence doesn't match conventional academic metrics. Stan's relationship with Ford highlighted the different forms intelligence can take. Ford possessed exceptional logical mathematical intelligence, theoretical reasoning, and academic capability. Stan possessed exceptional social intelligence, practical problem-solving, and strategic thinking. A psychologist would note that neither form of intelligence is inherently superior. They're simply different cognitive strengths suited to different challenges. Interestingly, the show revealed that both twins needed each other's forms of intelligence. Ford's theoretical knowledge couldn't have built or maintained the portal without Stan's practical skills. Stan's survival skills couldn't have solved the theoretical problems without Ford's physics knowledge. The most effective approach combined both types of intelligence. A psychologist would observe this as demonstrating that diverse cognitive capabilities have complementary value. Stan's intelligence ultimately proved crucial to the series' resolution, not despite his lack of formal education, but because of the specific capabilities he had developed through his unconventional path. His expertise in deception saved everyone. His strategic thinking defeated Bill. His practical skills supported the family throughout. A psychologist would recognize this as vindication that intelligence takes many forms and unconventional paths can develop genuine capabilities. After the memory recovery, Stan's intelligence remained intact. His strategic thinking, social perceptiveness, practical skills, and con artist expertise all returned along with his memories. A psychologist would note that these capabilities were core aspects of Stan's cognition, not just learned behaviors. His intelligence was intrinsic to who he was, even though he had never recognized or valued it appropriately. Stan's intelligence revealed how conventional educational systems and family dynamics can fail to recognize diverse forms of cognitive capability, how early labeling can create lasting damage to self-perception, and how trauma and adversity can paradoxically foster capability development. It also revealed that intelligence exists in multiple forms beyond academic achievement, that different cognitive strengths have complementary value, and that the skills developed through unconventional paths can prove uniquely valuable. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Stan's remarkable intelligence stood in stark contrast to his internalized belief in his own inadequacy, revealing how deeply he had absorbed his family's judgment despite overwhelming evidence of his capabilities. A psychologist examining Stanley Pine's internal world would identify shame and guilt as the twin psychological forces that drove his behavior for 40 years. These toxic emotions, internalized from his father's rejection and amplified by perceived responsibility for Ford's disappearance, created an internal critical voice that Stan carried everywhere, a psychological presence of Philbrick Pine's constantly judging, condemning, and finding Stan worthless. Understanding this internalized shame is essential to understanding why Stan punished himself through decades of suffering and why he believed love must be earned through extraordinary sacrifice. Shame and guilt, while often confused, represent distinct psychological experiences. Guilt says, "I did something bad." Shame says, "I am bad." Guilt focuses on specific actions that violated values or caused harm. Shame attacks the entire self as fundamentally flawed and unworthy. A psychologist would observe that while Stan experienced both guilt and shame, shame was the deeper and more destructive force in his psychology. Stan's shame originated in the science fair incident and his father's response. Whether Stan's action was purely accidental or contained unconscious sabotage, Philbrick's reaction communicated unambiguous judgment. Stan was worthless. Stan cost the family millions. Stan didn't deserve to belong. Philbrick's words, that Stan was kicked out until he could make back the millions you cost us, explicitly tied Stan's worth to financial compensation. A psychologist would recognize this as teaching Stan that his value was purely instrumental and conditional on achievement. The developmental timing of this rejection made it particularly psychologically damaging. At 17, Stan was in the critical period of identity formation that psychologist Erik Erikson identified as essential to healthy adult development. Adolescents need support, belonging, and acceptance as they develop autonomous identity. Instead, Stan experienced catastrophic rejection at precisely the moment when he needed acceptance most. A psychologist would observe that this timing virtually guaranteed lasting psychological damage. Stan internalized his father's judgment completely. Throughout the series, Stan's self-talk reflected Philbrick's voice and values. When Stan made mistakes or faced failures, he didn't just feel bad about the specific situation, he experienced global self-condemnation as fundamentally flawed person. In Weirdmageddon Part 3, Stan's articulation of his deepest fear, "Dad was right about me. I'm the screw-up who ruins everything," revealed how completely Philbrick's judgment had become Stan's own internal voice. A psychologist would recognize this internalized critical parent as what psychoanalytic theory calls a punitive superego, an internal psychological structure that constantly judges, criticizes, and punishes the self. For Stan, this internalized Philbrick was relentless. No accomplishment was good enough. No success erased the original sin of costing the family millions. No amount of suffering provided adequate penance. The internal father could never be satisfied. Stan's guilt about the science fair incident persisted for 40 years, despite the fact that the action was largely accidental and the consequences wildly disproportionate to any intentional wrongdoing. Stan believed he had deliberately sabotaged Ford, even though the evidence was ambiguous. He accepted responsibility for Ford losing his scholarship, even though Ford and Philbrick's reactions created the disaster as much as Stan's action. A psychologist would observe that Stan's guilt was inflated far beyond what the actual circumstances warranted. This pattern, accepting disproportionate responsibility and guilt, appeared throughout Stan's life. When Ford disappeared through the portal, Stan blamed himself entirely despite the accident occurring during Ford's aggressive confrontation. When things went wrong at the Mystery Shack, Stan blamed himself. When the twins faced danger, Stan felt responsible. A psychologist would recognize this as characteristic of shame-based psychology, where everything bad that happens must be your fault because you are fundamentally bad. Stan's criminal behavior paradoxically both expressed and punished his shame. By becoming exactly what his father had labeled him, a failure, a screw-up, a criminal, Stan fulfilled the prophecy and proved Philbrick right. A psychologist would observe this as what's called a shame-based identity, where you become the bad person you were told you were, partly because it provides consistent identity and partly because it feels like the truth about yourself. However, Stan's criminal behavior also served as ongoing self-punishment. He chose difficult, dangerous, poverty-stricken existence when his intelligence could have created legitimate success. He accumulated arrests, bans, and increasingly severe consequences. He lived in his car, got beaten up, went to prison, and generally suffered extensively. A psychologist would recognize this pattern of self-sabotage and self-punishment as driven by unconscious belief that he deserved suffering for his fundamental badness. The 30-year Portal Project represented Stan's ultimate attempt to atone for his sins and prove he wasn't the worthless screw-up his father had labeled him. Stan believed that successfully rescuing Ford would finally demonstrate his worth, earn forgiveness, and erase the shame of the original rejection. A psychologist would observe that this redemption fantasy was based on magical thinking, the belief that right action could retroactively undo the damage and change the past judgment. Stan's willingness to sacrifice everything, his identity, his life, his safety, his happiness, for the Portal Project revealed how much he believed he deserved nothing. People who believe they have inherent worth don't typically sacrifice their entire existence for redemption. Stan's extreme self-sacrifice demonstrated his core belief that he had no intrinsic value beyond what he could do for Ford. A psychologist would recognize this as tragic consequence of conditional love and shame-based identity. The show revealed that Stan's internalized shame affected every aspect of his self-perception. He believed he was stupid despite demonstrating remarkable intelligence. He believed he was worthless despite accomplishing extraordinary things. He believed he ruined everything despite saving his brother and eventually the universe. A psychologist would observe that shame creates cognitive distortions where evidence of worth and capability is systematically discounted or explained away. Stan's difficulty accepting compliments or recognition throughout the series reflected his shame-based self-concept. When people praised him or acknowledged his accomplishments, Stan deflected, minimized, or changed the subject. He seemed genuinely uncomfortable with positive attention. A psychologist would note that people with deep shame often cannot integrate positive feedback because it contradicts their core belief about being fundamentally bad or worthless. The contrast between how Stan treated himself versus how he treated others revealed the internalized double standard shame creates. Stan was often kind and protective toward Dipper, Mabel, Seuss, and others. He forgave their mistakes and supported them through difficulties. Yet, he showed himself no such compassion. A psychologist would observe that shame makes self-compassion nearly impossible. You can extend to others the understanding and forgiveness you cannot give yourself. Stan's relationship with money throughout the series reflected his internalized father's voice about being a financial burden. Philbrick had valued money above relationships and had rejected Stan for costing millions. Stan became obsessed with money, accumulating it through legal and illegal means, being extremely cheap in daily operations. A psychologist would recognize this as an attempt to prove he wasn't the financial drain his father had labeled him, though no amount of money could actually heal that wound. However, Stan simultaneously spent enormous resources on the Portal project and was willing to sacrifice financial security for the twins' safety and happiness. This contradiction revealed that Stan's relationship with money was driven by psychological wounds rather than consistent philosophy. The money obsession was about proving worth to internalized father rather than about actual desire for wealth. A psychologist would observe that when other values, like protecting family, conflicted with accumulating money, Stan consistently chose family. Stan's difficulty trusting others throughout the series stemmed partly from his internalized shame. If you believe you are fundamentally bad and unworthy, you assume others will eventually discover this truth and reject you. Better to keep people at distance through deception and emotional guardedness than risk them seeing your true worthless self and abandoning you. A psychologist would recognize this as self-protective strategy that paradoxically creates the isolation and rejection it fears. The show depicted several moments when Stan's internalized shame became explicitly visible. In Dreamscaperers, Stan's mindscape contained a locked box labeled shame, suggesting Stan kept his deepest feelings of worthlessness compartmentalized and hidden even from himself. In Not What He Seems, when Stan's deception was exposed, his defensive reaction reflected shame about being seen as the liar and criminal he actually was. A psychologist would observe that exposure of shameful truth creates intense psychological distress. Stan's prison conversation with Ford in Weirdmageddon Part 3 represented the only moment in the series when Stan directly articulated his core shame. His statement, "Dad was right about me. I'm the screw-up who ruins everything," revealed the internalized father's voice that had tormented Stan for 40 years. A psychologist would note that speaking shame aloud, naming it explicitly, represents important psychological step toward potentially healing it. Ford's response to Stan's shame confession provided exactly what Stan's wounded psyche needed. Ford didn't agree with Stan's self-condemnation. Ford didn't say, "Yes, you are a screw-up." Instead, Ford validated Stan's worth by acknowledging his own mistakes and recognizing Stan's unique capabilities. Ford said Stan would have immediately recognized Bill as a scam artist, offering genuine respect for Stan's street smarts and social intelligence that Ford lacked. A psychologist would observe this exchange as containing crucial elements of shame healing. Stan revealed his shameful core belief about being fundamentally flawed. Ford responded with acceptance rather than agreement, validation rather than condemnation. Ford acknowledged his own imperfection and mistakes, modeling that being flawed doesn't equal being worthless. Ford recognized Stan's genuine strengths, offering evidence that contradicted Stan's shame-based self-concept. However, one conversation couldn't undo 40 years of internalized shame. Stan's willingness to sacrifice his memories moments later demonstrated that his core belief in his expendability persisted. He still believed others' lives mattered more than his own existence. A psychologist would note that shame healing is a gradual process requiring repeated experiences of acceptance and validation, not single transformative moment. The memory erasure, paradoxically, both expressed Stan's shame and created possibility for healing it. Stan's willingness to lose his entire self demonstrated his belief that he had no intrinsic worth. His existence mattered less than others' survival. Yet the erasure also destroyed the internalized father's voice along with all Stan's other memories. When Stan woke without memories, he woke without shame. A psychologist would observe this as symbolically representing fresh start, unburdened by internalized judgment. The family's response to Stan without memories provided corrective emotional experience. They didn't love him for what he'd accomplished or because he'd earned it through sacrifice. They loved him simply as himself, working desperately to restore him, not because they needed him to save them, but because they valued his existence. A psychologist would recognize this as the kind of unconditional acceptance that can begin healing shame, being valued for being rather than for doing. When Stan's memories returned, the internalized shame likely returned with them. Decades of self-judgment don't disappear because of temporary memory loss. However, the experience of being loved in complete vulnerability may have created psychological opening for Stan to begin questioning his internalized father's harsh judgments. A psychologist would observe that experiencing acceptance while vulnerable can gradually shift internal working models of self-worth. Stan's decision to sail the world with Ford rather than continuing to prove his worth suggested possible shift in his relationship with shame and guilt. Rather than seeking redemption through continued sacrifice, Stan chose mutual enjoyment and shared adventure. Rather than trying to earn love through suffering, Stan accepted the relationship as it was. A psychologist would recognize this as potential movement toward healthier self-concept based on inherent worth rather than earned value. However, the show also suggested that Stan's shame and internalized critical father would likely persist as lifelong vulnerabilities. When stressed or facing failure, Stan would probably still hear Philbrick's voice telling him he's a worthless screw-up. When making mistakes, he would probably still experience disproportionate self-blame. A psychologist would note that healing shame doesn't mean it disappears. It means developing capacity to recognize shame as old wound rather than current truth. The tragedy of Stan's internalized shame was that it was based on lies. Philbrick was wrong. Stan wasn't worthless. He hadn't deliberately sabotaged Ford. He didn't ruin everything he touched. The evidence of Stan's worth, capability, and positive impact was overwhelming. Yet, shame distorted Stan's self-perception so completely that he couldn't see this evidence or integrate it into his self-concept. A psychologist would observe how powerfully early messages about our worth can override contradictory evidence. Stan's story revealed how parental rejection can create lasting shame, how internalized critical voices can torment for decades, and how shame creates self-fulfilling prophecies where we become the bad person we were told we were. It also revealed that shame drives self-punishment and self-sacrifice, that magical thinking about redemption cannot heal shame, and that true healing requires experiencing acceptance without having to earn it. The psychological truth that Stan eventually discovered, and that the show powerfully demonstrated, is that worth is inherent rather than earned, that love should be received as birthright rather than achieved through suffering, and that the harshest judgments we carry are often internalized voices of others rather than accurate assessments of our true value. Stan spent 40 years trying to prove he wasn't worthless when the real healing came from simply being loved as he was. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Stan's internalized shame drove decades of self-punishment and desperate attempts at redemption, yet healing came not from finally proving his worth, but from experiencing unconditional acceptance in his most vulnerable state. A psychologist observing Stanley Pines throughout Gravity Falls would identify a profound contradiction at his psychological core. Beneath decades of defensive armor, criminal behavior, and emotional guardedness existed an extraordinary capacity for love that Stan struggled to express directly, but demonstrated through consistent protective action and ultimate self-sacrifice. Understanding this hidden capacity for love is essential to understanding Stan's psychology, because it reveals that beneath the con artist exterior was someone desperately seeking connection while simultaneously fearing the vulnerability connection required. Stan's capacity for love was most clearly demonstrated in his relationship with Ford. Despite 40 years of separation, unresolved conflict, and mutual hurt, Stan never stopped loving his twin. The 30-year Portal project represented the most extreme expression of love imaginable. Stan literally sacrificed his identity and existence to save Ford. A psychologist would observe that this level of dedication and sacrifice reveals love so profound that it defined Stan's entire adult life. However, Stan's love for Ford coexisted with resentment, hurt, and anger. Stan felt unappreciated and taken for granted. He resented Ford's intellectual superiority and dismissiveness. He was hurt by Ford's failure to acknowledge his sacrifice. A psychologist would note that complex love, containing both devotion and resentment, both connection and conflict, is psychologically realistic and common in important relationships, especially those carrying unresolved trauma. Stan's love for Dipper and Mabel developed more straightforwardly than his complicated bond with Ford. From their arrival, Stan demonstrated protective care even while presenting himself as selfish and using them for labor. He kept their photo on his desk, despite claiming to be annoyed by their presence. He created elaborate schemes to give them positive experiences. He risked his life to protect them repeatedly. A psychologist would observe that Stan's actions consistently revealed love even when his words denied it. The disconnect between Stan's loving actions and his inability to express love verbally reflected his defensive patterns developed through decades of emotional guardedness. Stan had learned that expressing love created vulnerability that could lead to rejection or loss. Saying, "I love you," meant revealing emotional need and attachment. Stan protected himself by showing love through action while maintaining verbal and emotional distance. A psychologist would recognize this as characteristic of people with attachment wounds who want connection but fear intimacy. Stan's protection of Dipper and Mabel extended beyond physical safety to emotional well-being. When Dipper faced social challenges or felt inadequate, Stan offered gruff advice designed to build resilience. When Mabel experienced heartbreak or disappointment, Stan created distractions and positive experiences. While Stan's methods were sometimes questionable and his emotional expression limited, his underlying motivation was clearly love and desire to help them navigate difficulties. A psychologist would observe that Stan's parenting style, though unconventional, contained genuine care and respect for the twins' autonomy. He let them make mistakes and learn from consequences rather than hovering protectively. He trusted them to handle challenges while remaining available when they truly needed help. He supported their interests and adventures even when he didn't fully understand them. These patterns suggested Stan's love included respect for the twins as individuals with their own paths. Stan's love for Seuss demonstrated his capacity for loyalty and care extending beyond family. Despite paying minimal wages and sometimes exploiting Seuss's labor, Stan clearly valued and cared about him. Stan gave Seuss opportunities for growth, eventually entrusting him with the Mystery Shack. Stan showed up for Seuss's birthday with thoughtful gesture despite his usual emotional guardedness. A psychologist would note that Stan's capacity for love extended to chosen family, not just biological relations. Throughout the series, Stan's love expressed itself primarily through protection, provision, and sacrifice, rather than through emotional vulnerability or verbal affection. He protected those he loved from danger, provided materially for their needs, and sacrificed his own interests for their benefit. A psychologist would recognize these as valid expressions of love, though they lacked the emotional intimacy and verbal affection that create fully satisfying relationships. Stan's difficulty with emotional intimacy stemmed from his core psychological wounds. Having been rejected when vulnerable, Stan learned that showing emotional need invited abandonment. Having been loved conditionally, Stan believed he must earn affection through service rather than receiving it freely. Having internalized shame about his worth, Stan struggled to believe anyone could genuinely love him for who he was rather than for what he provided. The show depicted several moments when Stan's defensive armor cracked and his underlying love became visible. In Not What He Seems, when facing arrest and potential permanent separation from the twins, Stan's genuine care broke through his gruff exterior. His plea for Mabel to trust him carried real desperation and need. A psychologist would observe that crisis situations often penetrate defenses and reveal underlying emotional truths. Stan's willingness to risk universal destruction to save Ford revealed how completely love could override his rational judgment. Ford explicitly warned that activating the portal could destroy everything. Government agents explained the dangers. Yet, Stan persisted because his love for Ford and his need to rescue him outweighed all other considerations. A psychologist would note that this demonstrated both the strength of Stan's love and its potentially destructive power when unchecked by realistic risk assessment. The imprisoned conversation between Stan and Ford in Weirdmageddon Part 3 represented Stan's most direct expression of emotional vulnerability and need. When Stan articulated his deepest fear, that his father was right about him being a screw-up, he revealed the wound that had driven his behavior for 40 years. Ford's loving response validated Stan's worth and offered the acceptance Stan had desperately needed. A psychologist would observe this exchange as demonstrating that beneath all Stan's defenses was someone who needed to be loved and accepted. Stan's ultimate sacrifice of his memories to defeat Bill Cipher represented love in its purest and most selfless form. Stan gave up not just his life, but his very self, his memories, identity, and existence as Stan Pines to save everyone he loved. A psychologist would recognize this as the ultimate expression of love, choosing others' survival and well-being over self-preservation or self-interest, without expectation of reward or even memory of the sacrifice. The fact that Stan made this sacrifice willingly, without hesitation, and with humor and courage revealed the depth of love beneath his defensive exterior. His final thoughts before memory erasure centered on protecting his family. His mental representation in the mindscape tried desperately to preserve memories of loved ones even as everything else was destroyed. A psychologist would observe that in the moment of ego death, Stan's core identity revealed itself as fundamentally oriented toward love and protection. The family's desperate efforts to restore Stan's memories after the sacrifice demonstrated how completely he was loved in return. Ford openly wept and called Stan their hero. Dipper and Mabel worked tirelessly to bring him back. Everyone contributed memories and experiences to help reconstruct Stan's identity. A psychologist would note that this represented the kind of unconditional love Stan had needed his entire life. People fighting to bring him back, not because they needed him to save them, but because they loved him and wanted him to exist. When Stan's memories gradually returned, the first to resurface were those connected to love and family. He automatically recognized Waddles before consciously remembering the pig's name. He responded to Mabel's scrapbook with emotional resonance before explicit memory. A psychologist would observe this as suggesting that love and emotional connection exist at deeper levels than conscious memory, that bonds of attachment persist even when explicit memories are lost. Stan's decision after memory recovery to finally pursue his childhood dream with Ford represented choosing love and connection over defense and isolation. Rather than maintaining emotional distance or returning to his solitary portal project, Stan chose intimate ongoing relationship with Ford. Rather than proving his worth through continued sacrifice, Stan accepted mutual love and shared adventure. A psychologist would recognize this as significant psychological growth where Stan could risk vulnerability and intimacy. However, the show also suggested that Stan's difficulty with emotional expression and vulnerability would likely persist. His tendency to deflect sincere moments with jokes, his discomfort with direct emotional conversation, and his preference for showing love through action rather than words would probably remain as lifelong patterns. A psychologist would note that healing doesn't mean becoming a different person. It means integrating wounded parts while developing greater flexibility and capacity for intimacy. Stan's capacity for love existed in tension with his capacity for deception and moral flexibility. The same person who loved profoundly also lied constantly, ran criminal enterprises, and exploited others for profit. A psychologist would observe that humans contain multitudes. We are not simple or consistent. Stan could genuinely love while also genuinely deceiving. His love was real, even though his lies were also real. The psychological complexity of Stan's love included elements that were genuinely healthy: loyalty, protectiveness, willingness to sacrifice, and elements that were problematic: inability to express verbally, tendency to show love through control, difficulty respecting others' autonomy when protecting them. A psychologist would recognize that real love in real people always contains mixture of healthy and unhealthy elements, and growth involves strengthening healthy aspects while addressing problematic patterns. Stan's story revealed that capacity for profound love can coexist with significant psychological damage, that people can express love through action even when unable to verbalize it, and that defensive armor developed through trauma can hide but not destroy underlying capacity for connection. It also revealed that the deepest expression of love may be ultimate vulnerability and self-sacrifice, that healing involves learning to receive love as well as give it, and that transformation comes through experiencing unconditional acceptance. The relationship between Stan's love and his wounds was complex and paradoxical. His capacity for love drove his 40-year redemption project, yet his wounds prevented him from expressing love directly. His love motivated extraordinary sacrifice, yet his shame made him believe love must be earned through suffering. His love sought connection, yet his defenses prevented intimacy. A psychologist would observe that understanding Stan requires holding these contradictions simultaneously rather than resolving them into simple narrative. Ultimately, Stan's capacity for love represented his deepest truth and most authentic self. Beneath the con artist identity, beneath the criminal behavior, beneath the emotional armor and defensive patterns, Stan was fundamentally someone who loved deeply and completely. His entire adult life was organized around love, for Ford, for the twins, for the family he'd lost and the family he'd found. A psychologist would recognize this as evidence that love can persist through extraordinary adversity, and that our capacity for connection represents our deepest humanity even when wounded and defended. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Stan's extraordinary capacity for love existed in constant tension with his defensive armor, creating a psychology where profound devotion coexisted with emotional guardedness, and where the deepest expressions of love required ultimate vulnerability. A psychologist examining the climactic memory erasure sequence in Gravity Falls would recognize it as exploring profound questions about the relationship between memory, identity, and self. When Stanley Pines volunteered to have his memories destroyed to defeat Bill Cipher, he faced the ultimate psychological sacrifice, not just death of the body, but annihilation of the self as he knew it. Understanding what Stan gave up and what remained after the erasure reveals important psychological truths about what makes us who we are and whether identity can survive the loss of explicit memory. The plan to defeat Bill required Stan to sacrifice his memories because Bill existed within a mind and could only be destroyed by erasing that mind. Stan and Ford switched clothes so Bill would enter Stan's mind believing it was Ford's. Then Ford would use McGuckett's memory gun to erase Stan's mind completely, destroying Bill along with Stan's memories, personality, and sense of self. A psychologist would observe that this plan required Stan to voluntarily undergo what amounts to psychological death. Stan's willingness to make this sacrifice revealed several important aspects of his psychology. First, it demonstrated that Stan valued others' lives more than his own existence. His internalized shame and belief in his expendability made self-sacrifice psychologically possible. Second, it showed that Stan's love for his family outweighed his attachment to his own identity and continuity of self. Third, it revealed that Stan saw this as his ultimate redemption, finally proving his worth through the most extreme sacrifice imaginable. A psychologist would note that Stan's sacrifice differed fundamentally from physical death. Many people can contemplate dying to save loved ones, accepting bodily death while assuming some continuity of self or soul persists. Stan faced something more existentially terrifying: complete erasure of everything that made him Stan Pines. His memories, his personality, his relationships, his understanding of who he was, all would be destroyed. He would wake up, if the plan worked, as no one. The show depicted Stan's final moments before erasure with characteristic humor and courage. He taunted Bill, maintaining his con artist persona to the very end. His last words before the memory gun fired referenced feeling like some kind of Superman for the first time in his life, finally experiencing himself as capable and heroic rather than as the failure his father had labeled him. A psychologist would observe the tragedy that Stan experienced this self-affirmation only in the moment before losing the self that could remember it. The memory erasure sequence showed the destruction of Stan's mindscape, the deteriorating black and white mystery shack that represented his internal world. As memories were systematically erased, the structure collapsed. The mental representation of Stan tried desperately to hold on to memories as they were destroyed, particularly memories of family. His mental self's final words before complete erasure were about protecting his family, suggesting that even in ego death, Stan's core identity centered on love and protection. A psychologist analyzing this sequence would recognize it as depicting the relationship between memory and identity. Our sense of continuous self, the feeling that we are the same person we were yesterday and will be tomorrow, depends largely on memory. We know who we are through our accumulated experiences, relationships, and personal history. Destroying memory threatens to destroy the self that those memories create and sustain. When Stan woke after the erasure, he had no idea who he was, where he was, or why people were crying around him. He asked basic questions. What's going on? Why is everyone so upset? It's like you're at someone's funeral. A psychologist would observe that Stan without memories was still conscious, still present, still capable of perceiving and responding. But he had no personal history, no relationships, no understanding of himself as continuous entity existing through time. The family's desperate efforts to restore Stan's memories through Mabel's scrapbook and shared experiences represented their attempt to reconstruct his identity from external sources. They showed him photos, told him stories, brought him to familiar places, hoping these external prompts would trigger internal memories. A psychologist would recognize this as reflecting psychological understanding that identity can potentially be rebuilt through social scaffolding and environmental cues even when internal memory structures are damaged. The gradual return of Stan's memories revealed important patterns about memory organization and identity. The first memories to return were not explicit narratives but automatic responses. Stan automatically called Waddles by name before consciously remembering who Waddles was. He responded emotionally to the scrapbook before explicitly remembering the events depicted. A psychologist would observe that this suggests different types of memory stored in different ways, with emotional and procedural memories potentially more resilient than explicit autobiographical memories. Stan's character traits and personality patterns also persisted despite memory loss. His humor, his gruffness, his protective instincts, these emerged even before explicit memories returned. When threatened, he responded with characteristic defensive posture. When seeing his family upset, he showed concern despite not knowing who they were. A psychologist would note that this suggests personality may have some independence from explicit autobiographical memory, perhaps rooted in deeper neurological patterns or temperamental factors. The question of whether Stan without memories was still Stan raises profound philosophical and psychological questions. If Stan had no memory of his life, relationships, or experiences, was he still the same person? A psychologist might argue that identity exists on multiple levels. There's the narrative self created through memory and story, but also the embodied self existing in present moment, the emotional self capable of feeling and connection, and the relational self defined through bonds with others. The show suggested that even without explicit memories, something essential about Stan persisted. His family recognized him as Stan despite his memory loss. His fundamental patterns of being in the world, his humor, his protectiveness, his way of relating remained recognizable. A psychologist would observe that this suggests identity is not purely memory dependent, but includes embodied patterns, relational dynamics, and ways of being that persist even when autobiographical narrative is lost. However, the show also made clear that Stan without memories had lost something crucial to his identity. He didn't know who Ford was beyond the guy who looks like me. He didn't remember saving the universe. He didn't understand his own history or the significance of his relationships. The narrative continuity that gives life meaning and makes us who we are across time was completely disrupted. A psychologist would note that while something of Stan persisted, the loss was genuinely catastrophic. Ford's anguish at erasing Stan's mind revealed what was lost from external perspective. Ford said, "I wish I could tell you that you saved the world, Stan," as he prepared to fire the memory gun. The tragedy was not just that Stan would lose his memories, but that he would lose knowledge of his own heroism, his own worth, his own significance. A psychologist would observe that this speaks to how much our sense of meaning and value depends on remembered narrative of our lives and actions. The memory restoration sequence suggested that love and relationship might have special power to restore identity even after severe memory loss. The family's persistent efforts, the emotional connections they maintained with Stan, even in his blank state, the shared experiences they created, all contributed to bringing Stan back. A psychologist would recognize this as reflecting research showing that social support and relational continuity are crucial factors in recovery from severe memory impairment. Mabel's scrapbook served as external memory store, a physical object containing Stan's experiences and relationships preserved outside his damaged mind. As the family went through the scrapbook with Stan, the images and stories provided scaffolding for memory reconstruction. A psychologist would note that this illustrates how external memory aids, photographs, journals, stories told by others, can help maintain identity even when internal memory structures are compromised. The show depicted Stan's memories returning not as sudden flood, but as gradual process. First came automatic responses and emotional resonances. Then came fragments and impressions. Finally came more complete narrative memories. A psychologist would observe that this pattern, gradual reconstruction from fragments rather than instant complete restoration, reflects more realistic model of memory recovery than dramatic instant recall common in fiction. Stan's first returned explicit memory appeared to be of Dipper and Mabel themselves. He called them by name and recognized his relationship with them. A psychologist would note the psychological significance that Stan's deepest and most important relationships were the first explicit memories to resurface, suggesting these connections were most strongly encoded and most resistant to erasure. When Stan's memories fully returned, he emerged changed by the experience. He had experienced complete vulnerability and received unconditional love. He had lost everything and been brought back through family's devotion. He had proof that he was loved not for what he'd accomplished, but simply for being Stan. A psychologist would recognize this as potentially transformative experience. Being loved in state of complete helplessness and having nothing to offer can challenge beliefs about conditional worth. However, the show also suggested that Stan's core psychological patterns would largely persist despite the memory erasure and restoration. His defenses, his shame, his difficulty with emotional expression, these were not magically healed by the experience. Stan resumed his characteristic gruffness and deflection once memories returned. A psychologist would note that while the experience created potential for growth, lifelong patterns don't transform instantly through single experience, however profound. The memory erasure and restoration also had implications for Stan's relationship with Ford. The experience forced Ford to fully acknowledge Stan's value and heroism. Ford had to confront what losing Stan would mean. Ford had to actively work to bring Stan back, demonstrating through action the love and appreciation he struggled to express verbally. A psychologist would observe that this experience created opportunity for their relationship to transform, though actual transformation would require ongoing work beyond the immediate crisis. Stan's sacrifice of his memories represented the culmination of his redemption complex. He finally made the ultimate sacrifice that proved his worth beyond any doubt. Yet paradoxically, the sacrifice also destroyed his ability to know he'd proven anything. A psychologist would recognize the tragedy. Stan spent 40 years trying to prove his worth, finally succeeded in the most definitive way possible, but lost the self that needed proving. The redemption was complete, but the one who needed redemption was erased. The philosophical questions raised by Stan's memory erasure extend beyond the show into real psychological and ethical territory. What makes someone the same person over time? Is it memory, body, personality, relationships, or some combination? If we lost all our memories, would we still be ourselves? A psychologist would note that these questions become urgent not just in fiction, but in real cases of severe amnesia, dementia, and other conditions affecting memory and identity. The show's answer seemed to be that identity exists on multiple levels and no single element is entirely sufficient. Stan, without memories, was still Stan in some sense. His body, his personality patterns, his capacity for relationship remained. Yet, he was also profoundly not Stan. Without his memories and personal history, crucial elements of his identity were lost. A psychologist would recognize this as psychologically sophisticated understanding that identity is multifaceted rather than unitary. Stan's experience also illustrated the crucial role of other people in maintaining our identity. When Stan couldn't remember himself, his family remembered him. They held his identity for him through the period when he couldn't hold it for himself. They brought him back through their persistence, love, and willingness to help him reconstruct who he was. A psychologist would observe that this reflects important psychological truth. Identity is partly individual, but also partly social, maintained through our relationships as much as through our own minds. The ultimate message of Stan's memory, sacrifice, and recovery seemed to be that while memory is crucial to identity, love and connection operate at levels deeper than explicit memory. Stan's family loved him back to himself. Their bonds persisted even when he didn't remember them. The relationships proved more fundamental than the memories that usually sustain them. A psychologist would recognize this as expressing profound truth about human connection, that we exist not just as isolated minds, but as beings in relation whose identities are created and sustained through love. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Stan's memory sacrifice revealed the complex relationship between memory and identity, while demonstrating that love and connection can persist at levels deeper than conscious memory, ultimately proving more fundamental to who we are than the narratives we tell about ourselves. After examining Stanley Pines's psychology throughout Gravity Falls, we can identify profound insights about trauma, redemption, and healing that extend beyond the show into real human experience. While Stan is a fictional character whose story is constructed for narrative purposes, the psychological patterns he displays, attachment trauma, shame-based identity, redemption seeking through self-sacrifice, and ultimate healing through unconditional acceptance, reflect genuine phenomena that psychologists recognize and work with. Understanding what Stan's journey teaches us requires examining both what the show gets right about psychological reality and what it necessarily simplifies for dramatic purposes. Stan's story began with catastrophic attachment trauma at a critical developmental period. Being rejected and disowned by his father at 17, while simultaneously experiencing abandonment by his twin, created psychological wounds that shaped the next 40 years of his life. A psychologist would recognize this as reflecting research on attachment trauma, showing that severe rejection during adolescence can create lasting impacts on self-worth, relationship patterns, and identity formation. Stan's experience illustrates how a single traumatic event can create psychological trajectory affecting an entire life. The show depicted Stan's response to trauma as including defensive patterns that both protected him and prevented healing. He developed emotional guardedness that shielded him from further hurt, but also prevented genuine intimacy. He constructed elaborate deceptions that allowed survival but created isolation. He internalized shame that drove achievement-seeking but also generated self-punishment. A psychologist would observe that these patterns reflect common trauma responses. The adaptations that help us survive difficult circumstances often become obstacles to thriving when circumstances improve. Stan's 40-year redemption project, sacrificing his identity and life to save Ford, illustrated both the power of love to motivate extraordinary dedication and the psychological trap of believing worth must be earned through suffering. Stan genuinely loved Ford and wanted to save him, but he also believed that rescuing Ford would finally prove he wasn't the worthless screw-up his father had labeled him. A psychologist would recognize this as reflecting how trauma can create distorted beliefs about conditional worth that drive compulsive patterns attempting to earn the acceptance that should have been freely given. The show's treatment of Stan's redemption complex revealed important psychological truth. External accomplishments cannot heal internal wounds of self-worth. Stan taught himself advanced physics, maintained elaborate deception for 30 years, successfully rescued Ford from another dimension, and ultimately saved the universe from Bill Cipher. These were extraordinary accomplishments requiring remarkable capability and dedication. Yet Stan still believed his father was right about him being a screw-up. A psychologist would observe that this reflects reality. Achievements provide temporary satisfaction, but cannot fundamentally change shame-based self-concept developed through early trauma. What actually created possibility for Stan's healing was not his accomplishments, but his experience of unconditional acceptance. When Mabel chose to trust him despite his lies in Not What He Seems, when the family loved him back to himself after memory erasure, when Ford finally acknowledged Stan's worth in prison cell, these moments of being accepted without having to earn it created opportunities for healing that no amount of achievement could provide. A psychologist would recognize this as reflecting therapeutic wisdom that healing shame requires experiencing unconditional positive regard, rather than proving worth through accomplishment. The show depicted Stan's healing as occurring through crisis and vulnerability, rather than through gradual therapeutic work. The extreme circumstances of fighting Bill Cipher, being imprisoned together, sacrificing memories, and recovering from erasure created conditions for breakthrough moments of honesty and acceptance. A psychologist would note that while crisis can indeed catalyze psychological breakthroughs, sustainable healing typically requires ongoing work rather than single transformative event. The show compressed for dramatic purposes what in reality would be much longer process. Stan's relationship with Ford illustrated how unresolved trauma can create patterns that persist for decades despite loving intention. Both twins genuinely loved each other, yet they struggled to express that love directly or to heal their old wounds. Their conflicts recapitulated childhood dynamics even after 30 years apart. A psychologist would observe this as realistic. Trauma patterns are remarkably persistent, even with good intentions and genuine care. Healing requires not just love, but specific work addressing the underlying wounds and defensive patterns. The show's resolution of the twin conflict through crisis-forced vulnerability and honest communication reflected psychological truth about what healing requires. Stan revealing his deepest shame, "Dad was right about me," and Ford responding with validation and acknowledgement of his own mistakes created the emotional honesty their relationship needed. A psychologist would recognize these as crucial elements of relational healing: expressing vulnerable truth, being heard and accepted, mutual acknowledgement of mistakes, and choosing relationship despite imperfection. However, the show necessarily simplified the healing process for narrative purposes. Real trauma recovery typically involves many cycles of revelation, acceptance, regression, and gradual progress rather than single climactic breakthrough. Real relationships heal through countless small moments of connection and repair rather than one perfectly timed, vulnerable conversation. A psychologist would note that while the show's compressed timelines served its dramatic purposes, real healing is messier and more gradual. Stan's character also illustrated important truth about the relationship between trauma and capability. His difficult experiences forced development of remarkable skills: social intelligence, strategic thinking, practical problem-solving, deception expertise. These capabilities proved crucial to saving everyone. A psychologist would observe that adversity can indeed foster capability development, though this doesn't justify trauma, or mean trauma is necessary for growth. Stan's intelligence and capability existed despite his trauma, not because of it. The show's treatment of Stan's intelligence revealed how families and educational systems can fail to recognize diverse forms of capability. Stan was labeled the dumb twin, despite demonstrating remarkable cognitive abilities across multiple domains. His intelligence simply differed from Ford's academic brilliance. A psychologist would recognize this as reflecting common pattern where children are unfairly compared and those whose strengths don't match conventional academic metrics are incorrectly labeled as less intelligent or capable. Stan's criminal behavior throughout the series illustrated complex relationship between trauma, survival, and moral development. His crimes served practical survival purposes, but also represented rebellion against rejecting authority, performance of the identity his father assigned, and self-punishment for perceived sins. A psychologist would observe that understanding criminal behavior requires recognizing these multiple psychological functions rather than reducing it to simple moral failing or rational choice. However, the show also made clear that understanding the psychological origins of harmful behavior doesn't mean excusing it. Stan's lies hurt people. His cons exploited vulnerable people. His willingness to risk the universe endangered everyone. A psychologist would note the importance of holding both psychological understanding and ethical evaluation simultaneously. We can understand why people behave harmfully while still recognizing the behavior causes real damage and requires accountability. Stan's story illustrated that people contain multitudes and contradictions. The same person who loved profoundly also lied constantly. The same person capable of extraordinary self-sacrifice was also capable of selfish manipulation. The same person who sought redemption also continued harmful patterns. A psychologist would observe that real people are not simple or consistent. We contain competing motivations, conflicting values, and behaviors that don't always align with our intentions. The show's depiction of Stan's emotional guardedness and masculine performance reflected how trauma can create rigid defensive patterns that persist even when circumstances no longer require them. Stan learned that vulnerability invited rejection, so he armored himself with toughness and deflection. These defenses protected him during dangerous years but prevented genuine intimacy when safety was available. A psychologist would recognize this as common pattern. Our defenses don't automatically adjust to changing circumstances, but require conscious work to modify. Stan's ultimate sacrifice of his memories represented the culmination of his self-sacrificial patterns while simultaneously creating conditions for healing them. By giving up everything, including his own existence, Stan finally proved his worth beyond any doubt. Yet, the erasure also destroyed the shame-based self-concept that had driven the need for redemption. A psychologist would observe the paradox. Stan's greatest act of self-sacrifice also freed him from the psychological patterns that demanded self-sacrifice. The memory restoration sequence illustrated important psychological truth about the social nature of identity and the healing power of relationship. Stan's family held his identity when he couldn't, bringing him back through love and persistence. A psychologist would recognize this as reflecting research showing that identity is partly individual but also partly social, created and sustained through our relationships as much as through our own minds. Stan's decision after recovery to sail the world with Ford represented choosing relationship and shared joy over continued redemption-seeking and self-sacrifice. Rather than remaining stuck in patterns of trying to prove worth, Stan accepted the relationship as sufficient. A psychologist would observe this as representing psychological growth where Stan could value connection for its own sake rather than as something to be earned or maintained through suffering. However, the show also suggested realistic limits to transformation. Stan's defensive patterns, emotional guardedness, and difficulty with vulnerability would likely persist as lifelong tendencies, even with healing. His gruffness returned once his memories were restored. His deflection of emotional moments continued. A psychologist would note that healing doesn't mean becoming a different person. It means integrating wounded parts while developing greater flexibility and self-awareness. The show's ultimate message about healing seemed to be that redemption cannot be achieved through suffering and achievement, but only through experiencing unconditional acceptance. Stan spent 40 years trying to prove his worth, accomplish the right thing, sacrifice enough to earn love. What actually healed him was being loved without earning it, being accepted in complete vulnerability, being valued for being rather than for doing. A psychologist would recognize this as reflecting deep therapeutic wisdom about what creates genuine healing from shame and trauma. Stan's story also illustrated that healing often requires addressing multiple levels simultaneously. He needed Ford's validation and acknowledgement. He needed the twins' unconditional love. He needed to express his vulnerable truth about shame. He needed to experience being loved when helpless. He needed to make choices prioritizing relationship over defense. A psychologist would observe that comprehensive healing addresses cognitive, emotional, relational, and behavioral dimensions rather than focusing on single element. The show's treatment of Stan revealed both the possibility and the difficulty of healing from severe early trauma. Stan carried his wounds for 40 years before experiencing conditions that allowed healing to begin. His transformation required extraordinary circumstances, fighting interdimensional demon, sacrificing his memories, being loved back to himself. A psychologist would note that while most people's healing doesn't involve such dramatic circumstances, the underlying principles remain relevant. Healing requires vulnerability, unconditional acceptance, honest communication, and choosing connection despite fear. However, it's crucial to recognize what the show necessarily simplified or omitted. Real trauma recovery typically involves therapy, often includes medication, requires years of consistent work, includes many setbacks and regressions, and doesn't resolve as neatly as narrative demands. Real people don't get single climactic breakthrough that solves everything. Real healing is gradual, non-linear, and involves accepting that we carry our wounds even as we heal them. Stan, as character, served teaching function beyond realistic psychological portrayal. His extreme patterns made psychological dynamics visible that might be subtle in real life. His compressed healing timeline demonstrated principles that apply even when healing takes longer. His story illustrated that even severe trauma can potentially heal, even when that healing comes late in life and requires extraordinary circumstances. The psychological patterns Stan displayed, attachment trauma creating lifelong wounds, shame driving redemption-seeking, defensive patterns preventing intimacy, unconditional acceptance enabling healing, appear in real people, though typically in less extreme forms. A psychologist working with clients carrying similar wounds might recognize Stan's patterns while understanding that real healing requires ongoing therapeutic work rather than dramatic narrative resolution. What makes Stan's story valuable, despite its fictional compression and dramatic exaggeration, is that it illustrates profound truths about human psychology. Worth is inherent rather than earned. Love should be received as birthright rather than achieved through suffering. Defenses that protected us can imprison us. Healing requires vulnerability. Unconditional acceptance creates conditions for transformation. These truths apply whether experiencing them through fighting interdimensional demons or through ordinary therapy and relationship work. Stan's journey from rejected teenager to con artist to self-sacrificing hero to healed person choosing relationship over defense illustrated complete arc of trauma, survival, redemption-seeking, and ultimate healing. A psychologist observing this arc would recognize each phase as psychologically coherent, while noting that real lives rarely follow such clear narrative structure. Real healing is messier, more gradual, more uncertain, and more dependent on ordinary relationships and consistent work than dramatic breakthrough moments. Yet the core truth remains. Stan was told he was worthless, believed it, spent his life trying to prove otherwise through accomplishment and sacrifice, and ultimately discovered that healing came not from proving worth, but from experiencing acceptance. This truth applies whether you're a cartoon character fighting demons or a real person working through trauma with therapists and loved ones. The circumstances differ, but the psychological principles endure. Stanley Pines will remain forever as he was written, a character whose story served the show's narrative purposes and emotional arc. Real people have possibilities Stan never had. Access to therapy, ability to work through trauma gradually, opportunity to practice new patterns over time, capacity for growth that extends beyond single summer in Oregon. Stan's story can inspire and illuminate, but living our actual lives requires the longer, messier, more mundane work of showing up for ourselves and others day after day, choosing vulnerability over defense, accepting imperfect progress over perfect redemption. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.